Glad to see everybody, almost everybody. And so let's see. Well, again, we're having a virtual meeting. I think at some point we may have to have a discussion about whether or not you would all want to convene in person wearing masks. So anyway, that's something that we can decide at another time. I hope you all had a good 4th. Welcome back. And with that, Mr. Whitworth, I'm so glad to have Mr. Whitworth back.
Yeah. It's like a bad penny. Yes,
Mr.
Madam
Whitworth,
Chairman.
I'm going to turn it over to you.
Madam Chairman, in light of the continuing state of emergency declared by Governor Northam, where it is impractical or unsafe to assemble a quorum in a single location, I move that we adopt this agenda to take action to discuss or transact the business statutorily required or necessary to continue operation of the Commonwealth Transportation Board.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor, Carol will call the roll. Smoot? Mr. Dodson?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Ms. Hines?
Yes.
Mr. Yates?
Yes.
Mr. Williams?
Here.
Mr. Whitworth?
Yes.
Mr. Tunk?
Yes.
Mr. Malbin?
Yes.
Mr. Kasperlitz?
Yes.
Mr. Brown? Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Mr. Rucker?
Aye.
The roll is complete. The motion passed. Thank you. With that, we'll move on to the workshop agenda, and we'll start with Mena Lockwood.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm here today to present a revision of the cut-through traffic policy, which I hope to bring back to the next meeting in September and ask for your approval. CTB member Mary Hines requested an update of this policy several months ago, and she's been very helpful in reviewing and making sure we've appropriately handled the various comments. Could I have the next slide, please? Great. So before I delve into the policy, here's a little background on the residential traffic management programs at VDOT. This series of programs are designed to alleviate traffic problems in residential areas caused by speeding, trucks, or through traffic, and to raise awareness and promote caution in special conditions. So the traffic calming guidelines are designed to reduce speeding and improve safety for pedestrians and cyclists. Through truck restrictions, prevent trucks from taking shortcuts on roads that are not suited for them. The $200 fine for speeding signs create an additional deterrent to speeding. And the Watch for Children signs and Person with Disability signs are used as appropriate to warn motorists when extra caution is needed. So the cut-through traffic policy is also under the umbrella of residential traffic management programs, and it is used when there is an excessive amount of traffic cutting through a neighborhood and relief is requested by the residents. Typically, the complaints are more than just speeding, but include complaints about how the excess volume impacts quality of life and may even make it hard for residents to get to and from their homes. Next slide, please. The current cut-through traffic policy was adopted by the board in 1996 and has not been updated in those 24 years since, nor has it been used very much. The most frequent traffic complaint in neighborhoods is speeding, and the other programs such as traffic calming and the additional fine signs are more specifically targeted to combat speeding. However, widespread use of navigation apps over the last several years have increased the amount of traffic cutting through residential neighborhoods, as little-known local shortcuts become common knowledge. Because of the accompanying problems of this cut-through traffic, the dust has been blown off this policy, and it has been in use more over the last couple of years. The need to update the policy was clear as there were certain outdated aspects, like posting notices on courthouse doors. Also, some issues have arose during implementation this past year that have needed changes in the policy to resolve. Next slide. So let me give you a little update on what we've changed with the policy. We streamlined the process and provided better, more easily understandable definitions of terms, added numbered steps, and more clearly defined the responsibilities for participants. The numbered steps are shown here in this figure and also serve to help explain the policy a bit and the process for those who are unfamiliar with it. The process is initiated by the local neighborhood who reaches out to the locality. A study is then done to see if the street is eligible and to better define the problem. In order to be eligible, the road must be a local residential street in a secondary system. There must be 40% or 150 vehicles cutting through the neighborhood within any 1 hour, and a reasonable alternate route must be available. The study must also include identification of the kind of measures that might be part of a plan and their impact on the safety and operations of roads in the vicinity. Once VDOT and the locality agree on a plan, support from the neighborhood is sought before it is presented to the public, where comments from everyone are welcome. The Board of Supervisors or Town Council then reviews the plan and all input from the neighborhood and driving community. If they make a decision to endorse the plan, it is implemented by VDOT or the locality. The last step is for evaluation to see if it is meeting the objective and also to see if there are any unintended consequences. We also made the policy more consistent with the traffic calming guidelines with respect to how requests are initiated, the study process, public input, and the implementation of measures. And the policy has been made more consistent with through truck restrictions in that an adjacent locality that may be impacted must be consulted. Next slide, please. Another major update is that we developed a guidance document that includes a few of the strategies that can be implemented through this policy. None of these were documented officially anywhere before. So 2 examples are shown here. One is regulatory signs that prevent entering the neighborhood during the peak time of offense, and the second is actually a physical measure, the forced turn island, which prevents direct access into the neighborhood. Note that this would prevent the movement at all times of day. One thing to note about both of these measures is that they impact all drivers. It is not restricted to through traffic. Those that live in the neighborhood are also inconvenienced as well. These types of strategies can create longer travel times and more circuitous routes for residents, which is one of the reasons neighborhood support is very important, and public outreach is also included in the process. Next slide, please. Another change is that the number of households needed to support the cut-through plan has been reduced to 2/3 from 3/4. Many neighborhoods have complained that it is very difficult to engage residents and actually get 75% of the households to respond. So there were some requests that we sync this policy with the traffic calming guide, which requires only a simple majority. However, since the cut-through measures can often be so much more intrusive than those under traffic calming, we felt that 2/3 of the households was more appropriate. The policy has also been updated so that adjacent localities that may be affected by the cut-through plan need to be consulted. This change was a direct result of a situation that arose in Northern Virginia in the neighborhood shown in the map. Part of Thomas Avenue was defined as the cut-through route. It's shown there in a little purple line. The termini of the route was the county line, which you can see in this case was somewhat artificial as it doesn't terminate at an intersection or at any traffic-related change. The policy has been updated to prohibit such artificial termination and to require consensus from the adjacent locality on how the problem is defined and addressed. Next slide, please. Just to follow through with that change, under the proposed policy, the new proposed route for restriction would be all of Thomas Avenue between Algonquin Parkway and Lakeland Drive. The affected area could then be extended to include all of the area within the red dashed line. And also under the policy, the new policy, consensus of Loudoun County would be required for the proposed cut-through measures and their operational impacts. By including the adjacent locality, we help make sure that all the voices of the stakeholders are heard, and we can move forward with an alternative that meets as many of the objectives as possible. Next slide, please. Stakeholder outreach has been an important part of this policy development, and we reached out to our district traffic engineers and resident engineers who are the VDOT staff responsible for implementing the policy, and they in turn reached out to relevant localities. Next slide. Some 53 written comments were received and reviewed. Although some compromises were necessary and not every comment could be incorporated, all comments were addressed. Comments covered a wide range of issues, with many covering these major points listed here. The prevailing suggestion was that the number of households that must approve the proposal be reduced. And as I've mentioned before, we reduced that to 2/3 from 3/4. Another frequent comment was a request for clarification on how to address situations that affect more than one locality. And also, as I've mentioned, the new policy adds extensive language clarifying this issue. There were also requests to clarify the process and roles of the various parties, as well as the definitions of the primary use area, the cut-through traffic, and local roads. And those have all been incorporated. Additionally, the new policy modernizes the public outreach process and involvement. The last two comments in blue were requests that were not included or incorporated in any way in the new policy. The cut-through plan is only voted upon by the residents, and then once it's agreed upon internally, it's taken to the public, where comments are solicited from everyone at the public hearing. Also, collector streets are not eligible for this program, as the purpose of a collector street is different than a local residential street, and there are other programs that can help address issues that arise on collectors. Next slide. That's the end of my formal presentation, and I'm happy to accept any questions you may have.
Are there any questions from the board? Ms. Hines?
Thanks, Madam Secretary. I just want to commend Mena for the work that she and her team did on this. The policy is so much better. There's so much more clarity. And I think for communities that are trying to figure out whether they want to go this route, this is going to provide a lot more guidance about what they need to do, and what the role of the locality versus VDOT is. So I just think this has been great work.
Thank you very much, Ms. Smith. Thank you. Thank you for your support.
Okay. Well, and just for my colleagues, I would remind you all that this one kind of was turned up in our regulatory review, that we got rid of a regulation, but we said we need to come back and look at this policy. So, because it hadn't been touched since '96. So, nice little sidebar about the regulatory review.
So Ms. Hines, thank you so much, because it's really been through your leadership that we've actually been taking such a close look at our policies and regulations. So anyway, thank you so much for this. Thank you, Mena. We now have Mr. Mannell. Good morning.
Madam Chair, could I just interrupt for a question?
Oh, sure. Is it Mr. Williams?
Yes. Regarding the policy issue we just had, are we going to see a formal policy position or something to adopt from that, or?
May I ask everybody to mute their lines unless you're speaking, only because we can pick up so much background noise. I'm sorry, Mena, would you like to answer that?
Yes, certainly. At the next meeting, I believe that will be in September, we will have a formal resolution for your adoption of the policy.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Williams. Mr. Mannell.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the board. As a refresher, last year we conducted 2 sets of public information meetings on the 95 corridor. One was for problem identification and one was for operations upgrades, as well as the identification of potential capital improvements. This board approved a package of operations upgrades for the 95 corridor in January. And as you will also recall, there were over $1 billion worth of capital improvements projects identified along the 95 corridor. Due to that significant listing of needs, that study was put on hold so we could advance the 64 corridor improvement plan to a smart scale like recommendations evaluation stage, and then compare the rankings of projects in both the corridors to determine which projects would be best suited for the CTB's discretionary funds. And another important note, during the 2020 General Assembly session, House Bill 1414 was passed, which now requires the development of interstate corridor improvement plans to access the funding for that newly created Interstate Operations and Enhancement Program. So this is our next step in developing the 64 and 664 corridor improvement plan. I know the secretary indicated that she wanted this study to get underway in April, but we were overtaken by world events. So here we are, and we're getting ready to kick off our first round of public meetings. For this corridor study, there is a continued partnership between VDOT, DRPT, and the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment, similarly to what we did for 81 and 95 studies. Next slide, please. So I'm going to provide an overview of the plan itself, as well as address the significance of the 64 and 664 corridors in Virginia. Then we'll dive into a summary of the performance measures that we've collected for congestion and safety along the corridor, as well as a tentative project schedule. Next slide. So similar to what we did for 81 and 95, we are looking at the entire 64 corridor between West Virginia and Hampton Roads. We will be identifying performance issues for congestion and safety and developing a set of targeted improvements that focus on operation strategies, as well as improvements for parallel arterials to address incident management. Then looking at multimodal solutions, and if we cannot address the performance metrics that way, we will be looking at capital highway improvements. And following all those, we will conduct a smart scale-like evaluation on those multimodal solutions and potential capital highway improvements. Next slide. So in terms of the study area, the study team took a look at the corridor and determined that since the 664 corridor in Hampton Roads is inextricably linked to the 64 corridor, we looked at both corridors and we're going to evaluate both corridors. When there's an incident at the HRBT, the Montreal-Merrimack becomes a de facto route and vice versa. So from an operational standpoint, we thought that it made sense to look at both of those corridors together. And in addition, with the status of capital improvements on the 95 corridor as yet undetermined, the approximate 3-mile section of the 95 and 64 overlap in Richmond was also included in the study area. The 25-mile section of the 81 and 64 overlap in Augusta and Rockbridge counties already has a number of recommendations that are funded through the I-81 corridor program. The study team did look at that section from a performance measure standpoint, but we are not developing any additional solutions for that segment at this time. When you sum up all those segments, the resulting length of the corridor is approximately 320 miles. Next slide, please. So I-64 connects the state capital to the Blue Ridge Mountains to the west and the Atlantic coast to the east. It is a critical east-west commuter travel and freight route with multimodal options, including van pools, carpools, commuter and express buses, and is supported by a network of park and ride lots. Now, the corridor becomes much more multimodal as you move from west to east, with just about every mode represented in the Hampton Roads. It's also a significant freight corridor with over 7.2 million trucks and $135 billion worth in goods moved each year. And this is strongly influenced by the presence of the Port of Virginia. And as you can see, the corridor does see its fair share of incidents, with over 900 per year that have an average clearance time of 1.5 hours. And we've seen over 21,000 crashes over the last 5 years. Next slide. And as I just mentioned, the corridor offers a variety of multimodal choices that provide connections locally, regionally, and nationally. There are 8 transit agencies that operate service along the corridor, and they account for 27 million passenger trips annually. The 2 largest being the Greater Richmond Transit Company in Richmond and the Hampton Roads Transit Agency down in the Hampton Roads area. Those 2 alone account for over 40% of the Commonwealth's transit ridership, which does not include WMATA. There are major ongoing efforts to modernize and improve bus service, such as the Richmond Transit Vision Plan implementation and the Hampton Roads Strategic Plan. We also have Amtrak service. It offers daily rail service to Richmond, Roanoke, Newport News, and Norfolk. and it connects the 64 corridor to other destinations of Virginia and across the country. The Commonwealth recently adopted Transforming Rail in Virginia program, plans to add additional service to Norfolk, Newport News, and Richmond over the next 10 years, with one new round trip train to Norfolk by 2021 and one new round trip to Newport News by 2026. And in addition, that Transforming Rail in Virginia initiative also includes the Commonwealth's purchase of the Buckingham Branch Line, which is a rail line that runs parallel to the 64 corridor west of Richmond, and preserving this corridor for future opportunities for east-west passenger service. There are also approximately 36 park and ride lots along the corridor with over 4,400 spaces, and they act as starting points for commuter bus service, carpool, and van pools. Next slide. So I would be remiss if I did not discuss some of the current investments along the corridor. There have been a significant number recently. Over the last 5 years, there have been over $325 million worth of widening projects completed in the 64 corridor between Richmond and Newport News. That includes segments 1 and 2 on the peninsula, as well as the widening between 295 and Bottoms Bridge in Richmond District. And over the next 6 years, there's going to be almost 15 times that level of investment in the corridor between Williamsburg and Chesapeake, just accounting for these 4 major capital improvement projects, which include 64 widening segment 3 on the peninsula, the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel expansion, and the implementation of Hampton Roads Express lanes, as well as the high-rise bridge. The presence of additional express lanes in the region is going to provide motorists with more reliable trip options than currently exist. Next slide, please. So let's dive into the performance metrics for capacity and safety. As in the past interstate corridor studies, the study team created histograms for the 4 key performance measures summarized over the entire 320-mile corridor. For all of the charts, westbound is blue on the top of the chart and eastbound is yellow on the bottom. This data is summarized for 5 years and covers 2014 to 2018. It also includes, again, both overlap areas for 95 and 81. We're going to be covering both the number of severe injury and fatal crashes, which you see on this diagram, as well as the rate of severe injury and fatal crashes, person hours of delay caused by incidents blocking a lane of travel on the interstate for greater than 1 hour. And in each of these, the study team identified the locations with the highest 25%, and that 25% line is represented by the dashed line that you see on the graphs. And for this chart, the number of crashes are converted to an equivalent property damage only. This is similar to what we do in Smart Scale. And you can see that the information is peaking in the 95-64 overlap within the Richmond area, near the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, as well as the I-264 interchange area down in Hampton Roads. Next slide, please. The EPDO rate accounts for the amount of traffic on the roadway expressed in crashes per vehicle miles traveled. So when this information is reviewed, there are several hotspots to the west of the 81 overlap in both directions between Lexington and Covington. And this is due to the relatively high rate of crashes versus comparatively low traffic volumes. And there are also some spikes in the westbound direction on Afton Mountain. As many of you know, there are issues related to fog on that area, as well as some grades. And we also have issues east of the 95 overlap near Laburnum Avenue in Richmond, and in Newport News and near the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. Next slide. The annual person hours of delay per mile shows areas where there is heavy congestion along the corridor. The hotspots are principally in both directions in the 95 overlap near Newport News, which is likely caused by the impacts of segments 1 and 2 widening projects, Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, I-264 and I-664. The space needles in this corridor are in both directions on either side of the HRBT and represent approximately 275,000 person hours of delay. So to put that in perspective, the Space Needle on southbound I-95 at the Occoquan was over 1.2 million person hours of delay, which is about 4.5 times the worst amount of delay on this corridor. Next slide. For this measure, we are measuring the delay caused by incidents blocking one lane of traffic for greater than 1 hour. And since the incidents are random events, they do impact the travel reliability along the interstate. You can see, again, we've got issues in the overlap within Richmond area, as well as on the peninsula, Newport News, and the approaches to the HRBT and 264.
Madam Chairman, Mr. Mannell,
Yes, sir.
can you help me understand the EPDO?
So the
Maybe go back,
EPDO
maybe you
is,
go back a slide or two and explain that.
sure. I think it's about 3 slides back, Carol. There you go. So the equivalent property damage, what we do in Smart Scale is translate the crashes into a monetary value based on their severity. And we have specific numbers that we have identified for Virginia in terms of what is a traffic death cost on average. What does a severe injury that requires hospitalization cost on average, as well as, you know, if you have a visible injury but don't have to go to the hospital, and whether you have just property damage only, like you just have a fender.
So it says project damage, which sort of threw me off.
Oh, that is a typo. I'm sorry.
Well, that's what I didn't understand. And
Should be property damage.
Yeah, thank you. And secondly, and maybe we can do this offline to not belabor it, I'd like to understand the calculation that results in the graph. You know, you're obviously assigning a monetary value as we looked at on other safety concerns. And so a death is worth something versus a serious injury versus a whatever, less serious injury. So maybe I can talk to you offline about that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Excuse me, Madam Chairman.
And forgive the delay. I am muted as well. So kind of jumping in takes me a second or two to turn on my microphone because of the feedback people get from me. So yes, Mr. Whitworth.
Ben, go to the next slide that talks about the EPDO crashes per 100. That one. We kind of flipped by right quickly. I don't quite understand that on the 57 mile point where in the Lexington, that thing is twice as high as any peak we've got. Is that on 81 or is that on 64? And what specifically is the issue right there?
That is the ramp from 64 to 81. And we are looking at that as a potential area for a capital improvement as part of the study.
Well, that makes an easy decision, I would think.
It does stand out.
Was that not part of the I-81 study?
The accidents are actually happening on 64 approaches as versus actually on the 81 overlap itself at that location.
Okay, that's just, it looks extraordinarily an outlier to the whole graph. And it looks to me like has some significant importance to us.
Yes, sir, it does. We're looking at that. And like I said, we've identified that as an issue and have talked with Stanton District about potential solutions that we need to consider at that location.
It's like 900. I mean, it's 9 times your sort of straight line average line that you have in there, right? From 500 to 4,500.
Yes, sir. And again, the reason that you see, I think, a preponderance of really high spikes when you talk about the rate of crashes is that there aren't necessarily more crashes in that location than there are in the overlap in Richmond or down in Hampton Roads. It's just that the traffic volumes in that portion of the corridor are very low. So your rate, even if you have a similar or less number of crashes, will still appear higher because you have less traffic volume.
And this was not picked up in, this was not picked up in the I-81 study. Is that what you're saying?
Correct, because these crashes are occurring actually on the approach as you come from and leave Lexington. They're on the 64 corridor itself, not on 81.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Whitworth, the questions that are being raised right now, I think are really important. When I first saw this, the data from this presentation, I too was very surprised and actually very grateful to have this information. It does show you the importance of looking at transportation as a system. And so anyway, I think there is much that comes from this particular study. So anyway, I'll turn it back to you, Ben.
Okay, thank you. Carol, I think we're on slide 12. Okay. These next series of charts are going to show the average travel speeds and how they vary throughout the corridor. The measure that we're looking at here is documenting the average speeds in the corridor over a year, summarized by both time of day and day of week. And we also have time of year, which also provides some insights on overall travel reliability on the 64 corridor. We did something similar to this on the 95 corridor, if you recall. So in these graphs, the dashed line that runs across represents the posted speed limit. And in some cases, near the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, for example, the average speeds drop 25 miles per hour below the posted speed limit in that area. So you'll see these bands, and really the note here is that they represent percentile speeds. So we've got the dark blue is 25th to 75th percentile. The light blue is the 5th to 95th percentile. The big takeaway here is the wider these bands, the more variability you have in speed. And that translates, we think, to where we have really big reliability issues. So no surprise, HRBT is showing up on this graph. This represents eastbound 64 on a typical weekday between the AM peak period, 6 and 9 a.m. During 2018. Next slide. We also looked at westbound. Again, this one is in the evening along the corridor between 3 and 6 p.m. in 2018. And again, you can see some definite issues that are showing up. The impact of speeds in the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel area is more significant during this time, with average speeds dropping to around 15 miles per hour or 40 miles an hour less than the speed limit. For perspective, that speed drop is higher than what is actually shown on the 95 corridor at the Occoquan, which was the Space Needle for delay. And there are also fluctuations near 664, Newport News, and the 95. And you can also see Afton Mountain, where we have the grades heading up the mountain, and a few spots west of Lexington. Again, that stretch of the corridor has some geometric challenges, both horizontally and vertically. Great. Next slide, please. So we also looked at weekends, and this is, when you looked at weekends, we focused on either Saturday or Sunday, but looked at the entire day from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Over the course of the year. And this is looking at the eastbound direction. And you can see here that this is just the blue and the light blue bands are for the entire year. But we've also in this slide incorporated the summer months, June, July, and August in that dashed orange line. You can see that during the summer months, we focused on the area to the east of 295. And this chart shows that the variability in speeds on Sundays is much more severe during those summer months, which is no surprise to anybody that's driven the corridor. And in some cases, it's quite a bit more severe, at least 10 to 15 miles an hour or less. Next slide, please. And in the westbound direction on Sundays, on a weekend, the difference is still there in terms of between your typical day anytime during the year versus the summer months. The difference isn't that as great, but it's still slightly worse during the summertime. Next slide, please. So we also looked at the eastbound direction on a typical weekday, Tuesday through Thursday, during the afternoon peak, and brought that summertime travel in so you could see the variability that we're seeing between the typical peak periods and what happens on the weekends. Again, there's quite a significant delta in a lot of areas, particularly in the gap between Richmond and Newport News. So there's some reliability issues at the seasonal level. Next slide. And this is the same thing, and we've just done it for westbound. So it's your typical PM peak during a weekday compared against the summer weekend travel. And you can see there's, again, a fairly significant delta in that gap. Not so much at the HRBT and other areas that see a significant amount of commuter traffic during the week, but that gap between Richmond and Newport News is showing up again from a seasonal perspective. Next slide. So the study team also collected origin destination information in both the 95 and, in both the 64 and 664 corridors from Streetlight. That information was analyzed in detail for both the Richmond and Hampton Roads regions to help the team understand how traffic was actually moving in the corridor. This chart shows the 64 origin destination data for all vehicles between Charlottesville and Hampton Roads for the 2 peak periods, 6 to 9 a.m. as well as 3 to 6 p.m. on a typical weekday, again, Tuesday through Thursday. And you can see that the top of the chart is westbound and the bottom is eastbound. The heaviest pairs in the Richmond region during both peak periods are those trips that occur within the overlap area. Again, not surprising. And the heaviest pairs in the Hampton Roads region occurring during both peak periods are between 564 and 264 on the south side. So as we take a deeper dive into this origin destination information, it's going to be providing us with some helpful insights as we begin to think about and try and determine what types of transit options may benefit the corridor. I will provide one important side note here. You don't see any trips crossing the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. I want you to take note of the scale on the legend here and note that the origin destination pairs with less than 750 trips are not shown. I can assure you that there are trips going across the bridge tunnel, as you will see on the next slide. Next slide, please. So we zoomed in on the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel just to prove that there are trips that go across. Note again that legend and the scale. We've adjusted the scale so that we are showing trips that are less than 750 in terms of pairs. If we had tried to show this on the quarter level one, you wouldn't be able to read anything. So what this is really showing is that although lots of vehicles travel through the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel on a daily basis, they are coming from and going to dispersed areas on each side of the water, and that's leading to few highlighted connections. Next slide. We also looked at weekend trips. The weekend origin destinations vary depending on whether it's Friday, a Saturday, or a Sunday. In this case, for Sunday, there are more trips to and from the Short Pump area in Richmond, and more trips to and from the 264 corridor in the Hampton Roads region. Next slide. So in terms of some key conclusions that we've taken away from looking at these performance measures, both Richmond and Hampton Roads districts have the highest number of fatal and severe injuries per mile. Stanton District, as you all noted, has the highest rate of fatal and severe injuries per mile. And again, that's really due to the low volumes, but relatively high crash rates, as well as a lot of the geometric challenges that we experience once you get into the mountain areas in terms of horizontal and vertical alignment. The Hampton Roads District and the 95-64 overlap in Richmond have the highest annual person hours and incident-related delay per mile. Next slide. Travel time reliability in parts of the corridor is definitely an issue. As we noted previously, between Richmond and Hampton Roads on the weekends, particularly in the summertime. In Richmond to the west of the Bryan Park interchange, as well as in the 95 and 64 overlap area, and in the Hampton Roads region on 64, as well as the 664 loop during the week and in peak periods. Next slide. In looking at the origin destination analysis findings, particularly in the Hampton Roads region, we noted that there were significant, limited significant origin destination pairs for the water crossings. The only exception to that is Newport News Shipbuilding, which is an outlier. It's a major employer for the region, and there is a significant amount of traffic that uses the Monterey-Merrimack Bridge Tunnel to come and go from the south side to the peninsula for that origin and destination. The key travel challenge for the Hampton Roads region is that the trip data indicates that there's dispersed employment centers and workforce, meaning that we don't see a lot of major producers and attractors in the region, with the exception of a few like Newport News Shipbuilding and the Navy. So in looking at that origin destination analysis in Hampton Roads and looking at the travel speeds analysis, we feel that there's definitely a need that's indicating we need to bring the express lanes network online on both the peninsula and south side. That express lanes network is going to provide a reliable trip option for that region. So that was one of the obvious kind of takeaways that we had after looking at the data. Next slide. In terms of tentative schedule for the study, we will be conducting our first virtual public information meeting on this study starting tomorrow. And we are going to be requesting feedback from the public on, again, the existing conditions on the corridor, getting validation on those, as well as potential strategies they would like for us to consider for improving safety and operations. In July and August, the study team is going to be using the performance measures data, those top 25% locations for congestion and safety issues, as well as feedback that we received from the public to finalize the draft potential improvements for operations, multimodal, and highway capital strategies. And then similar to 81 and 95, we're going to conduct a smart scale-like analysis on those projects that can be ranked. And we're going to be comparing the scores from 64 projects to the 95 projects and working with OIPI to develop potential project packages. And the last two public meetings are going to be scheduled sometime between September and November to provide the opportunity to the public to review and provide comments on proposed improvements, and then review the refined improvement recommendations. Next slide. So virtual public meetings. Really, when I say that, we are developing, or we have developed, a online survey We're going to be again using MetroQuest, which we used for the 95 corridor study. We had pretty good, I would say really good success on getting feedback using that tool. We've recently been using it on other corridor studies around the state. I believe we did a Rails to Trails study recently on the Eastern Shore where we got over 3,500 public comments using this tool. So we're going to be taking advantage of that. In addition, we created a public meeting website that has a 3-minute introductory video. It will include a link to this presentation, as well as a description of the performance measures, public meeting boards, and the online survey. Everything that the public would be able to see at a typical face-to-face meeting will be available on the website. Once the comments and questions are received from the public, we are committing to create a running list of frequently asked questions and responses, and those will be posted weekly over the initial comment period, which will run for the next 30 days. Next slide, please. You can go to the major projects website on the Commonwealth Transportation Board website and access va64corridor.org. You will be able to get to the online survey, as well as all of the materials that the public will have access to see in terms of displays on performance measures. And we also have access right now to the enhanced public meetings website. Everything is live as of this morning. So we're ready to get started and get moving on with our first phase of public meetings. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Ben, thank you so much. Are there any questions or thoughts from the board?
Madam Secretary, I have a question.
Sure.
Ben, great job. I really appreciate the presentation. I've got a question about an earlier slide. I think I remember it said crash disbursement time was around an hour and a half. And I want, is that the time for the total disbursement, or is traffic moving during that? And I think a couple of years ago, we had a little study or talk about trying to see if we could move that time frame along. Has the average gone up or gone down? Basically concerned about the amount of time the roadway is stopped.
Correct. So I think the net metric you're referring to was on a very early slide on talking about the significance of the corridor. And that was just a metric where we looked at the clearance time of incidents. So the clock starts when the incident occurs, and an incident can be anything from a vehicle stopped on the shoulder to actually a travel lane being blocked. And that's where you see a variance of times. We just focused in on what we considered a natural break point for the data to show that 1.5 hour clearance time. But we do have data on the actual clearance time and how that's changed year to year. We can provide that in a future presentation, or we can get that to you individually if you'd like.
I'm just curious if it's gotten much worse, and if we are actually working on trying to make that situation better, quicker.
That is a target for our operations folks in the districts. I know that they track that regularly.
Madam Secretary.
Thank you.
Mr. Donohue.
Mr. Yates, I also just wanted to add, and Mr. Mannell, you did a great job on the presentation, so thank you for that. That the discussion I think we've also had over the last several years was initially focused on the 81 corridor and then the 95 corridor. On both of those, the board has funded, and the department is in the process of implementing, and in certain cases has completed implementing a host of operational improvements to try and help them bend that down. And so I do expect that in our next round of presentations to the board, we will have a similar set of operational improvements recommended for this corridor that will help us try and drive down some of the incident response times on this area. I think on 81, we're a bit more mature, and we might have information we can bring back to you all in future meetings. But on the 64 corridor, I want to be clear, we have not yet actually implemented a set of those operational improvements funded with the new interstate money that the General Assembly adopted in 2019.
Thank you.
This is Al just a quick question. Do you think the widening that has occurred in the last 2 years in the Hampton Roads area would have had a dramatic effect on the numbers that we're seeing from here from 2018?
The answer to that question is yes. Most definitely, the numbers that you see, and we actually kind of dove in to that, and because we were aware that there would be potential issues related to the construction zones, and in general, I believe for the actual numbers, because we did specifically pull this, but I believe that the incident rate within the work zones on the peninsula in segments 1 and 2, we actually saw an increase of about 60% in terms of the number of crashes within those work zones in the Hampton Roads district. In the widening between 295 and Bottoms Bridge, which is in the Richmond district, I think we saw about a 10% increase in crashes within that work zone area. So yes, work zones definitely have an impact on that metric, and we have made note of that and taken that into account when we're looking at these.
Reliability metric now that the work zones have been cleared and added lanes are there.
Yes. So in terms of the reliability, I believe that the first segment was opened in 2017. We looked at the travel speeds during 2018, and the second segment, I believe, was opened in 2019. So we're kind of straddling that area. I think you can see some issues of reliability in the Newport News segment on that graph. But again, you'll note that there's definitely about 30 or 40 miles between Bottoms Bridge and Newport News that you're still seeing a lot of residual reliability issues, particularly during the summertime and on the weekends.
And Allison, anecdotally, we haven't done any work on the tunnels or on the approaches to the tunnels in terms of widening. The widening is done further up, and anecdotally, it's much more reliable where the widening has occurred. But we still have that issue between the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel and Mercury Boulevard, because none of that's been touched yet. But it should change dramatically when that happens.
Been my impression too, just driving through back and forth to the Eastern Shore. It seems that where it's been opened, it really has improved dramatically.
It's dramatic to me. Yeah,
it really is. Thank you. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Ben, I really appreciated this presentation when I saw an earlier draft. I am grateful that you did that deeper dive on the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, which I think presents a much more accurate picture. So, as I think about the work that has been done through these studies on I-81, 95, and now 64, I do believe that Ben and his team and Nick, they've created such a great structure for us to actually examine our corridors and trying to determine, what are the real issues rather than what we assume to be the issues, and just how connected all of this is. This is important as the funding from I-81 goes into the interstate fund in order for us to actually manage those revenues and appropriate those revenues. It's important that we look at the entire interstate network, particularly since some of the funds are not designated to a specific corridor. So anyway.
Madam Secretary, this is Carlos. I'm sorry, I was fumbling around to get off mute. I did have one question. So obviously, in looking at the really, I guess, 200 through 220 exits on 64, there's this perception, obviously, that that's a major issue in part because of the weekends and the summers. But I think there's also been a view, though, that in general, congestion on that corridor between, Richmond and Hampton Roads, where widening hadn't occurred, is still an issue. But I guess, are you suggesting that the data is not reflecting that that's as persistent a problem as I think the Richmond district members tend to believe it is? Just trying to get a sense of that.
Mr. Brown, I believe that in looking at the graphs, there's an issue between that stretch in terms of there is performance below the speed limit over the year average, particularly during the peak periods of the morning and the afternoons. But it's really, really pronounced during the summer weekend periods. I mean, it's off the charts, comparatively speaking.
And Mr. Brown, this is Mr. Donohue. I would add, I think it's really what the data shows us is that in that larger stretch of the gap, it is at the moment, and I want to stress at the moment, because I also think as you widen other segments, you need to then analyze what the impacts are on places that have not been improved. But it shows that it is at the moment an acute seasonal problem during the warmer months, which doesn't mean that there are not problems during winter. There are obviously some areas where we could see, degraded performance. It was just kind of showing that the more severe problems were not necessarily year round, but were kind of in the, May to, September timeframe.
Madam Secretary, this is John Malvern. Could I make a comment, please?
Good morning, Mr. Malvin, of course.
Ben, by the way, that was great data. Good work. But you mentioned the two high employment centers, the naval base and the shipyard. It's been discussed many times over the years that we need a transit solution for those two employment centers. And it's been banged around, but I don't think we've ever identified an impactful transit solution that would have a great benefit to that corridor. I travel that corridor during peak periods, and I see a tremendous amount of single occupancy cars going to the naval base. And it seems like we could partner with the Navy or something to try to mitigate that in some capacity.
Mr. Malvin, we definitely agree. We've had some initial discussions with DRPT as well as Hampton Roads Transit to talk about those two employers in particular. We are aware of some of the issues related to, I believe, the Newport News Shipbuilding. The anecdotal stories that we've been told are that folks actually show up for their shift over an hour early just because of the parking issues at that location. And we have talked about the issues at the naval base. This is similar to kind of what we saw at Fort Belvoir on the 95 corridor, another major military installation and employer along that corridor. And we were seeing a lot of trips that were passing through the most congested stretch. The naval base is not really that different. The challenge that we have and the discussions that we've had with DRPT and Hampton Roads Transit is that we've in previous discussions have talked about the need for not only having a line of transit that serves the naval base, but also having what we consider an interbase circulator. The base is so large that folks feel like they have to drive their vehicles to get from one end to the other, should they be, during the course of the day. So we've been having discussions with both DRPT and Hampton Roads Transit about the potential for looking at an interbase circulator route.
Thank you. I just think that's a huge opportunity. As much money as we're spending to try to expand the capacity, it seems like a solution in that space would be very beneficial. So thank you.
Mr. Malvin, just know that there are many on this call today who really appreciate that question. Anybody else on the board?
Madam Secretary, I just have a comment. Like Dixon expressed, I'm a little baffled by the high rate of crashes in that area near Lexington. And if I recall, the terrain there is pretty level. So I'm really curious as to what's driving that. Is it the weaving motion that occurs as folks are trying to get off on the Lexington exit there on 64? Or what else would be driving that?
Mr. Tunk, as you will recall probably from driving or on that stretch, one of the issues that we have is I-64 eastbound movement, and that to I-81 northbound is a left-hand merge that comes onto 81. Those are always somewhat problematic. Like I said, the study team is keenly aware of the performance metric that is showing up at that stretch. And we are working on developing recommendations to try and improve that ramp and locations associated with that in proximity to Lexington, Route 11, and those areas out there. So we've had some discussions with Stanton District, and we are going to go back to them and with some potential solutions and get some feedback from them and come back with those that we will share with the board and the public going forward.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else?
Madam Secretary, it's Bert Dodson.
Mr. Dodson.
That stretch, and there again, I hear what you're saying as far as accidents. It sounds pretty simple, but I've driven that before, and people just don't slow up when they're coming down 64 hitting 81. They don't slow up. They just sometimes speed up. So it's going to be kind of hard to change those behaviors too. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dodson. Okay. With that, I think we will move along to Jitender on the VTrans needs. I just wanted to let the board know that prior to the action meeting today, we will be breaking for a lunch break. It's going to be more extended than perhaps some of our others during our virtual calls. We are planning to break for about an hour. Because of a meeting we need to have. And so anyway, just wanted to let you know now as you're kind of thinking through your day. With that, I'm going to turn that over to Jitender. Nick, are you part of this as well?
Very briefly, Madam Secretary. So I just wanted to just give a quick kind of introduction, and I'm going to hand it over to Jitender to run through the presentation. But for members of the board, this is, just another kind of building upon the presentations you received for the last 2 months, starting with mine 2 months ago, talking about how we want to work to develop the product development pipeline, and then also the presentation last month from Mr. Tucker, where he talked about how we would use really a kind of performance-based product development concept to put together those types of solutions to try and make sure we are getting the most cost-effective solution so we can address as many problems as possible. A key aspect of how we do all of this work is taking the hundreds of needs that were identified, midterm needs that were identified by VTrans. We will not be able to develop potential solutions for all of those. And so we will need to prioritize those needs in a manner. And so what Jitender, Mr. Ramchandani is going to walk through is kind of the how we're proposing to do that prioritization of needs. And then the second half of the presentation is going to be talking about beyond the kind of this near-term need for VTrans, how do we start to think about the future above and beyond kind of this 10-year window here? That is going to be an ongoing discussion. This is simply kind of the first of that. I also know Ms. Day and Mr. Ramchandani have been reaching out to board members, and I believe have met with about a little over half of you all. And for those of you who haven't, had our virtual meetings with, we hope to complete those soon. But that's really kind of what we're doing today. It's really building on some of those steps that we've talked about previously, and we really do look forward to working with you all and the affected stakeholders to prioritize these projects so we can get moving on this product development pipeline. And with that, Jitender, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Donohue. Good morning, Madam Secretary, members of the board. Given that this is my first presentation in a virtual setting, what I will do is I will pause a few times during the presentation to see if there are any questions or comments. So with that, next slide, please. So as Mr. Donohue mentioned, the board approved VTrans midterm needs in January. And at the time, the board directed us to work on two items. The first one was, as Mr. Donohue mentioned, the VTrans multimodal project study pipeline, which has the first step, which is based on the VTrans, and I will share more on that in a few minutes. And the second one was to start conducting analysis for the identification of long-term needs. So as Mr. Donohue mentioned, we will share some updates related to the items that board directed us to work on back in January. Next slide, please. Just for reference, VTrans has two types of needs. The midterm needs that the board adopted in January are more specific and identify needs for infrastructure and services. They include 4 years beyond the adopted 6-year improvement program and are utilized for smart scale as well as for revenue sharing programs. The long-term needs, on the other hand, are policy-related considerations to ensure a gradual and more systematic transition in preparation for the opportunities and challenges that we see on the horizon. Next slide, please. So now a bit more details on each of those two subjects, starting with what Mr. Donohue referred to as the VTrans multimodal study pipeline. And next slide, please. So in January, the board again adopted the VTrans midterm needs and directed us to prioritize the thousands of miles of needs that were adopted. The prioritized list of VTrans midterm needs is the first step in what Deputy Secretary Donohue branded as the VTrans multimodal project study pipeline in his May workshop presentation. In essence, the prioritization of the midterm needs will impact how and where VDOT and DRPT funds are utilized for studies. Over the last 4 rounds of Smart Scale, the board has raised the bar for what is considered to be ready for Smart Scale. So for jurisdictions that may not have their own funds to study all of their needs, this prioritization exercise becomes even more important because they have greater reliance on the VDOT and DRPT funds. Based on the direction from the board, this prioritization can serve purposes beyond the project study pipeline that is presented here. So in short, I think it is an important exercise, and so the thought is to provide a few more details for your review and guidance. Next slide, please. We recommend prioritizing the board adopted needs in 4 steps. And I will go through each step, starting with this slide. So the first step is to identify how this prioritization will occur. And so our recommendation at this time is that for corridors of statewide significance, these are corridors that include interstates and as well as routes 13, 17, 29, 58, etc., that the board has deemed of statewide significance, these corridors be prioritized at the state level, which means that needs along I-81 in Bristol will be compared against those along I-95 in Northern Virginia. Similarly, needs along Route 13 in Hampton Roads will be compared against those needs along I-64 in Culpeper District for this exercise. Second, for the regional networks that are essentially the urbanized areas and safety needs as well as needs to access industrial areas, the staff recommendation is to prioritize those at the district level, which implies that a transit access need in Blacksburg will be compared against that in Roanoke Similarly, a safety need near Amelia Courthouse in Richmond District will be compared against that in the city of Richmond. So for the prioritization, there are four travel markets within VTrans, and the approach is generally aligned with how the board has conducted, the policy that the board has adopted for Smart Scale. In Smart Scale, there is a high priority grant program and the district grant program. So this approach is aligned with that. Next slide, please. The next step, or the second step in this, is once we have established how this prioritization will occur, the second step is what criteria do we use to prioritize? So at this time, the staff recommendation is to use the four criteria that are listed on the slide. I will start with the first one, which is the severity of the need. So for example, if there is a congestion need, does it take 20% of more time to travel during morning peak hour, or does it take twice as long? So in other words, how severe the need is. The second one is how many users are affected by it, or what is the magnitude of impact? For example, if there is a need for transit access, how many residents will gain access to transit? Similarly, for highways, if there is a congestion need, how many vehicles are impacted? The third criteria is the co-located investments. For example, if there is a project in the 6-year improvement program that may address that need, then there might be some value in waiting a bit longer before conducting any additional studies. Similarly, if there is a congestion need that is co-located with a need for bridge replacement, then that we want to make sure that we are taking that into consideration as well. And for the final criteria, it is we are utilizing Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences projection, and based on the Governor's Executive Order number 45, we are identifying risk associated with flooding and sea level rise. Just as an example, Route 460 in Giles County, approximately 5 miles from West Virginia border, was recently closed due to mudslide from flooding. So as we are prioritizing need, the idea is to have a greater awareness of the risks that we see, given that some of these facilities have a useful life of 15, 20, 30 years. So first step was how we conduct the prioritization. The second step is what criteria we use for the prioritization. The next slide, please. The third criteria is, the third step is to systematically apply thresholds. Essentially, prioritization can essentially be seen as an exercise of drawing two lines within the need to separate the most pressing needs from the needs that can wait a bit longer. So that requires establishing thresholds, and this is something that we plan on doing based on the direction that we get from the board, as well as the outreach that we plan on conducting in the coming months. Next slide, please. And the fourth and the final step in this is that once we have established how we do the needs, we apply criteria, we establish thresholds. As part of the fourth step, we recommend applying different weights for different types of studies. We recommend, for example, having one set of weights for the statewide prioritization that I mentioned for corridors of statewide significance. For district level prioritization, which will be done for regional network needs, safety, and access to industrial sites, the idea is to allow, is to have different weights for either for different districts or different area types to essentially reflect the needs, the priorities of the regions. So for example, in Smart Scale, there are 4 area types. After the benefits are calculated, then those weights are applied. So congestion benefits receive more weight or a higher priority in area type 1, which is Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads, whereas safety has the greatest weight or a higher priority when it comes to some of the less urban areas. So our plan is to do an exercise similar to that based on the direction that we receive from the board. Next slide, please. And throughout this, we see this as an iterative exercise where we conduct analysis, gather feedback, make modifications, and then gather feedback before seeking a board action on this. Next slide, please. Throughout this, as we apply different, so as far as the next steps are concerned, for us on this one, we are conducting some analysis and would like to develop some weights that I mentioned, similar to smart scale. We are planning on bringing a few options for your consideration. And again, they will look, they may look very similar to what the weights that have been adopted by the board for smart scale. And the VTrans need categories, just for reference, are included in the table on the slide. Next slide, please. The slide, a timeline for this work is shown on the slide. Currently, we are on the second step from the top, which is this presentation. And we will be developing some initial analysis or discussions with local and regional entities that we plan on conducting a set of regional workshops in September where we gather feedback. And after we incorporate feedback, we plan on reflecting that analysis that is released generally to around October timeframe in the draft form for review and feedback, and with the intention of seeking or requesting board action in December. Just as as part of the final step, Mr. Donohue had outlined 4 steps, which was once the prioritization occurs, then the study-related activities commence. And so after this last step in December, all the study-related work will be conducted working with VDOT and DRPT on locations that are that the board deems to be of higher priority. So with that, I will pause for a minute before moving on to the next topic of the presentation and see if there are any questions or comments.
Madam Secretary, this is Mary.
Hi, Mary Hines.
Jitender, thank you very much for laying this out for us. I do have a couple of questions. My first question is way back at the beginning when you talk about separating into the statewide pot and the district prioritization pot. I'm confused by not identifying urban development areas as in the district level pot. And so if you can just help me understand why that's not that's one of the things we look at in everything else we do. Why is it not there?
Ma'am, at this time, I think this is the type of feedback that we were hoping for. At this time, the staff or the study team had 2 reasons for doing that. The first reason was that urban development area needs were submitted directly by localities and have not necessarily been vetted by regional entities, or even, for example, there may be jurisdictions that might be neighboring the entity submitting them. The second one is that the urban development area needs tend to be much. I would say probably it would be one way to put it would be to say they are less complex. So, for example, those are needs for sidewalks, bike lanes that may not require significant resources, the type of resources that are anticipated for this type of work. Having said that, we were planning on conducting or funding those type of studies via an OIP grant program that we are planning on rolling out in the coming months. The grant program is called Growth and Accessibility Planning Technical Assistance Program. So it is an extension of the work that OIP has done in the previous years. It used to be called Urban Development Area Grant Program. And so this is a rebranded effort. And this is with an idea that for local initiatives, it might be more suitable to provide more flexibility to local jurisdictions to conduct studies as they deem fit. as opposed to having a state-led initiative or a, did I answer your question, Ms. Hines?
You do, Jitender. I do think that that when you're doing regional network work and then you come to a town or a more dense place, if you don't get the network right in the more dense place, that connectivity can fail. And as the secretary observed earlier, it's all a system. The whole thing is a system. So if you're going to create something special or different in terms of accessing these planning dollars for those kinds of solutions, I think that has to kind of roll out at the same time. I don't think it can lag. And I think that the other observation I'll make, having been in local government and watched the way we fund transportation change over the last so many years, this issue of access to planning dollars is becoming more and more acute at the local level, and even more so now with the onset of COVID and everybody's revenue is in the tank. And so there's a lot of interest in what's the pot of money? How much money are we actually talking about being available? And I think that the amount of money or where the money comes from is going to have a lot to do with whether people view this as worth their time to figure out, or whether it's just viewed as a little tiny blip. And so I think that if you can provide more clarity, are we talking about a couple of $1 million and every study having access to 100,000, or is it something different? You will get different kinds of buy-in. And that was the problem we had last time with this, was people didn't think it was going to have any real effect on what they were doing locally. And so again, I think how you set this beginning part up, how you talk about UDAs, those things are really going to, in the end, matter, at least in my region, in terms of how much people engage.
Through the Ms. Hines, Mr. Ramchandani, if I could just kind of jump in. Ms. Hines, thank you very much for those comments. I think it might be helpful maybe if we could talk with you and some other folks as well about kind of how the program is structured. I do think I think there's some flexibility in that. The other thing that I think, two other things I would note that are of importance is this is simply what is being presented. Ultimately, if the board wants the district level prioritization to include the urban development areas, I want to be clear, like, you all can ask us to do that and we can make that change if that's where the preference of the board is. And then the other final thing I would just kind of say, and that is, in some of the regional networks, they have overlapping needs with the UDAs. So again, they're not always discrete and separate. And so a lot of the more complex UDA needs tend to also be regional network needs. And so they would still have the opportunity to be a part of the project development pipeline and the greater work through that process, which is not my way of saying, like, that doesn't mean there is or is not an issue here. I was just trying to provide that for some additional context. And so I do think, and Jitender, I'd ask you to put together some stuff that perhaps we can show to Ms. Hines and other board members that may be interested to show where that overlap kind of happens in certain areas, and then kind of the category and nature of project that might otherwise not be included. And maybe that's something that we need to give them to help them as they think about whether they want UDAs in this or not.
Thank you, Mr. Donohue. That's, I think, a very helpful suggestion. And certainly for the board's purposes, I think understanding more clearly the, what would typically not be considered. I mean, up here, we wouldn't propose anything where we weren't talking about sidewalks. It just would be silly. But anyway, I think if you can give us more detail and also help us understand where the overlaps are in our districts, that may help us figure out And it will provide clarity to the local jurisdictions who were asking to opine on this as well.
Thank you. And Ms. Hines, I will just add that sidewalks and bike paths are becoming ever more important to all districts. So just wanted to mention that. Is there anybody else on the board who would like to offer a question or
Madam
comment?
Secretary,
Mr. Whitworth.
the gender, and maybe others have a better understanding of this than I do. But from a macro look, as I sit back and listen to the process of prioritization that is proposed, I feel like there's significant overlap or duplication of the same process that we go through with Smart Scale. And so my question would be that once VTrans does their prioritization, down the road, is that going to preempt the prioritization that may come out of a Smart Scale process on a given plan, whether it's statewide or district level? How do these two prioritizations dovetail with each other to the end of decisioning?
Mr. Whitworth, if I may, this is Nick kind of jumping in here again. Mr. Whitworth, I would say, so what VTrans is doing is looking at the degree which a problem exists, and then we are going to prioritize those. We're not saying that whether or not this is the most cost-effective project. This prioritization is saying, what are the problems we think we need to be developing and spending money developing, putting in place solutions for. Smart Scale, then, when we have that potential pool of candidate projects, is identifying what is the most cost-effective one to implement at that time. And I hope that doesn't sound like a terribly nuanced distinction, but VTrans is what is the problem and which problems do we want to try and develop projects to solve them for. Smart Scales, of those potential solutions, what gives us the most bang for the buck. And so I think they're similar, as you noted, but I don't think one will ever replace the other. Or the intent is not for one to replace the other.
Thank you.
I do believe that if it's done well, it should go hand in hand, and the VTrans should support the Smart Scale process. And I think, from my time on the CTB, my concern early on was, VTrans was only used basically as a screening process, but we weren't really developing and using it as a planning tool. And that is what we're really trying to construct here, that kind of process.
Madam Chairman.
Mr. Miller.
Thank you. Nick, just to push that out a little bit on what you're thinking and what you said. When I look at the categories for prioritization on VTrans, and those are that's obviously what we're using to decide what the needs are. To Dixon's point, I guess I'm wondering, and maybe I'm asking the same question, but if we have one set of prioritization steps or categories in VTrans that sets the priority, and then we judge their effectiveness by other measures, how do we ensure that one complements the other? I mean, it would seem to me that you'd sort of start with the same measures. So you got, an overall planning process has one set of criteria or categories, and then you've got a scoring process has a different, sometimes overlapping, but different set of categories. And I'm not sure I understand. I mean, I heard your answer. Maybe I just didn't understand it. It seemed to me you'd have the same ones, right? And you judge them against each other, and whichever gave you the right bang for the most bang for the buck, you do that, but you wouldn't necessarily change the categories by which you judge them. Does that make sense?
I believe I understand the question that you are asking. And I think part of this is made more difficult by talking about these in the abstract. Like in a way, it may be easier if we actually like drill down on one versus another. And so to me, again, you have the various needs categories for VTrans. Those are actually set out in the Code of Virginia. And again, that's saying the corridor of statewide significance, the regional networks, the urban development areas, and we've administratively kind of interpreted that to also include industrial development areas and rural locations. And then also in the code through Smart Scale is a requirement that potential projects must meet a need in VTrans and then must be evaluated for their benefits relative to costs for 5 to 6 factors, depending on where they're located in the state. So again, in both of these, we're following provisions laid out in the code. I guess the distinction I'm trying to draw, and I feel that I'm not doing it terribly clear, is that VTrans is where you all, through policy, indicate what is something that you believe at some point could be worth spending money on. That is kind of simply what this midterms needs do. And the kind of the thought process there and with the requirement in law is if something doesn't actually address a midterm need, it can't even be scored or eligible for scoring and in turn funding through Smart Scale. And so again, what we're trying to do here is keep the project development cupboard, if you will, full of candidate projects. But there may be needs that don't have a cost-effective solution. And so I think what Smart Scale is doing is once we have these potential candidates down, and we always want to have more candidate projects than we have money for to make sure we're actually prioritizing through Smart Scale, in my opinion, you know, it is going to look at those potential solutions and say which one is more cost-effective. We can't really do that at the VTrans stage because we just figured out what the need is, and then we're going through the process of developing the solution. And only by comparing the solutions against each other, looking at the kind of benefits relative to cost as Smart Scale does, can we then tell you all which ones are the most effective ones from our perspective to fund. Obviously, the board has policy discretion there, and you know, no scoring process is perfect, and so there can be external factors that would be considered, but that's kind of what I see the difference is. And Mr. Miller, I'm nervous I kind of said the same thing again, but slightly differently, and I hope that is more clear, but if it's not, I will take it away that we need to keep fine-tuning this description so that it is not opaque to you all in the future.
No, I get it. And I think I was asking the same question that you'd already answered once. So I think my question was along the lines of Dixon's, but we'll keep talking about it. It was really about the categories that you use and shouldn't they be the same. But I hear you. I understand the difference in the processes, and we'll just talk offline more about it to get my head straight about it. Thanks.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, Nick and Jitender, thank you so much. I also thank Ronique Day. I know she has a lot of, she puts a lot of effort and thought into getting this orchestrated.
And Madam Chair, that was just the first half of Jitender's presentation.
I'm sorry?
That was the first half of the presentation. The second half was kind of
Okay, Jitender.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Secretary. And just to clarify my earlier comment, I think there are sidewalks and bicycle needs in regional networks. So those would have been covered even if it's under just regional networks. Carol, can you switch to slide number 13, please? Thank you. So the second and final topic, Madam Secretary, members of the board, is identification of long-term needs. So far we were discussing on infrastructure and service-related needs, and by long-term needs we are referring to the needs that occur that we anticipate to be ready in the 10+ year prime horizon. So the intent is to provide an overview of the approach. This is the beginning of the discussion for your review and guidance, and you will be seeing more on this subject in the coming year. Next slide, please. So in January, as part of the board resolution, the board directed staff to develop a trends analysis that can be utilized to identify long-term needs. So other than being a federal and Code of Virginia requirement, long-term needs are also used by for-profit entities and as well as non-profit entities, not-for-profit entities such as universities, and they essentially prepare an organization for challenges and opportunities on the horizon. Next slide, please. So this graphic is from a recent issue, one of the recent issues of Harvard Business Review, and differentiates between tactics, strategy, and vision. And so in this case, the idea is generally to show the variability or uncertainty that comes with time. There is more certainty as we are talking about next year or the year after that, and that level of certainty decreases as we are referring to 10+ year planning horizon. Next slide, please. So the graphic on the right shows that variability and uncertainty that increases as the planning horizon changes, goes from short term to long term. Our intent is to evaluate a range of impacts. Impacts could be positive or negative to account for that uncertainty and be somewhere on this band, be somewhere between scenarios and explorations. And we have looked at other states and how this work is done in other states, and best practices are that we have observed are places or states where long-term planning is more comprehensive and systematic. So, Madam Secretary, your point about transportation being a system and doing a systematic analysis is one of the best practices that we have found. The reason is that, for example, technology trend alone may not give us a full picture because it will have impacts as far as the economic trends are concerned, demographic trends are concerned. In other words, it is the synergistic effect that needs to drive the needs and the long-term needs as opposed to impact of individual trends. So we have been looking at a number of trends, including technology trends, automation, vehicle automation, fuel type, vulnerability trends, economic trends, demographic and land use trends. And we realized that individual trends have been looked at by VDOT and DRPT for very specific purposes. Our intent is to utilize them and to look at the synergistic effect to develop 3 scenarios that A, are more neutral, and B, reflect that synergistic effect that trends will have and combined. So in essence, we are planning on, the staff is proposing to develop 3 scenarios to convey that range or a range of impacts and opportunities that come with a different trend. Next slide, please. The purpose of these 3 trends, these 3 scenarios would be to provide some analysis for board's consideration to show the range. And the long-term planning or needs are different as they address more foundational questions. So for example, needs for safety projects and expansion projects, will it vary as the technology matures? And what will that do to other parts or functions of organizations? Next slide, please. So in this case, we are again planning to do in a 4 step. I will quickly go over them just in the interest of time. And so the first one on the upper left corner is the identification of external factors. These are factors that are outside, generally are macro factors, national and global trends, such as technology, sea level rise, and precipitation events, economic trends. So identification of external events, things that are largely beyond our control. The second step involves identifying or having our priorities listed, which is based on the board's vision and goals and objectives. So we have identified 15 key performance indicators. And as part of the third step, we will see how those external factors are impacting those KPIs or key performance indicators to come up with recommendations or a range of recommendations for board consideration as part of the 4th and final step. Next slide, please. So this is, here's another way to look at it. So we start at the top, external factors, demographic trends, technology, vulnerability due to sea level and flooding. We look at the demand side, key performance indicators. So how does the demand for transportation and services change? That will have an impact on what level and what is provided as a supply of transportation, service and infrastructure. So the difference between the desired trend and projected trend is where we see the impact. So for example, the board has adopted an objective to reduce vehicle miles traveled. And in this case, if the impact that we find from technology trends, or one of the trends is that the trends indicate that those will have an adverse or less than desired impact on the key performance indicators, then we identify action as part of the step 4 to mitigate or reverse that. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, a timeline of the long-term needs is presented on the slide. So we are at the very first step, and our intent is to request board action or bring something to the board in between now and the next year for review, and request board action sometime next year. And during this, we will also be reaching out to local and regional partners for their review and feedback. And with that, that was a quick overview of our approach to the long-term needs. And I will pause here to see if there are any questions and comments.
Any questions?
Madam Secretary, it's Mary. Thank you, Jitender, for this again. You know, I think we're all everybody's sort of struggling with what the effect of COVID is going to be. And while that seems short term, I do think that there are longer term implications, whether it's that more people choose telework or more people are fearful of transit, and that those, depending on how the world deals with this disease over time, those could have major effects on how we spend money in transportation. So and then there are things where we have major policy changes, like I think that Virginia sort of going in with the RGGI has implications for transportation too. So I guess I'm wondering aloud, because I think this is when you go to the fall meeting, these are the kinds of things you're likely to hear. Mm-hmm. Do those fit into these external factors from the point of view that you all are looking at it? You have a place to put those kind of near-term worries that may in fact be tips of icebergs for policy change or redirection of funding moving forward.
Madam Secretary, yes, Ms. Hines. In fact, Colorado DOT, they were getting ready to adopt their state transportation plan, or I think they are still planning to adopt it. And what they did is because they had already completed the work as part of the board the resolution in Colorado, they said we need to revisit this in a year. So they are going to have an amendment to that, and they have done a short-term impact analysis that they have included in their state transportation plan, and they are planning to revisit that assumptions that they developed in a year to see how they have changed. Given that we are just starting, I think we have the benefit of being able to glean the observations or the short-term impact that we see or we have seen in the past 3 or 4 months. So they do fit in the demographic as well as the technology trends that are considered external factors. It is generally the demand for transportation that is impacted because of the societal changes.
Thanks.
I'm trying to unmute myself as well. Mary, I think that, all of us are going through a thought process trying to grapple with all the issues that we are confronting and could continue to confront, and perhaps even some unexpected things coming down the pike. And, from a national perspective, we are working through some of this. From a regional perspective, we are working through issues, and then here in Virginia as well. I don't know if Jennifer Mitchell or Jen DeBrule are on the call, but the looking at all of this, it's been somewhat of a theme of looking at the systems, because what could affect us here in Richmond could affect what goes on in Northern Virginia and Maryland and perhaps the whole East Coast. And so we are meeting, discussing, engaging with partners from Metro to the Greater Washington Partnership to DC and Maryland and North Carolina and partners here in Virginia, really trying to assess where we are. And one of the things is sharing information and data, best practices, forecasts, trying to determine the needs of business and industry and government as we're going through this. And Metro has been conducting some business surveys, and Jen DeBrule or Jennifer Mitchell, if you're on the call, it might be interesting for you to share some of the work that we're doing in trying to anticipate and better position ourselves as we are looking at transportation and what the priorities might be and how they might change.
Sure. As you mentioned, Metro is doing a survey of in the DC region of trying to get a better handle on traveler behavior and commuting trends. Through our telework program, we're also plan to do some work to also survey some businesses and better understand teleworking trends and what we can expect to see from some commuting behavior going forward. We are, we've always had a long program. We work with VDOT as well very closely on this to promote teleworking and transportation demand management strategies. We're in the process of reevaluating some of those programs and intending to ramp up some more, more programs that are designed to help support teleworking behavior as well. So we do expect in the coming months to have some more information that we'll get from some of these surveys and some of this business outreach as well.
And I think really the point is that we're trying to integrate all of this into our decision modeling efforts as we're dealing with the budgets and forecasts. And so, Mary, as you're kind of thinking out loud, we are as well, and just really appreciate that. And certainly we'll be bringing back that information to the board as we move forward. Anybody else on Jitender's presentation? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
With that, we will have Margie Ray. Good morning.
Good morning, Madam Secretary, members of the board. Hope everybody's doing well. And hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. I always kind of need that reaffirmation nowadays. All right. Well, I'm back before you today. Recently I've had a lot of conversation with you all about safety. And today I'm giving you an update on where we are with midterm performance for the other performance measures. So next slide, please. So the MAP 21 Federal Law FAST Act, it establishes performance measures and performance targets that we needed to develop for both asset condition, system performance, congestion, air quality, and safety. Safety is on a different time frame from all the other measures in that it's on an annual basis. And I'll speak a little bit more about that in a moment. So it was back in 2017 that through the General Assembly and the House Bill 2241, Senate Bill 1331, that it gave you all the authority to establish performance targets for surface transportation. That was further modified in 2018, where it also incorporated performance measures and targets for the federal performance measures that we're talking about today. Next slide, please. So I wanted to kind of give you a recap and some background on what those federal requirements are. The baseline performance period that was established was calendar year 2017, and so all of our data generally trends along that as calendar years. But the law also required that each state had to establish 4-year targets, so that takes us through calendar year 2021 for all of those measures, and then 2-year targets for some of those measures. And so we're right there at that midterm performance period of reporting out on how we performed through calendar year 2019. We did submit a baseline performance report back in October 2018. I believe that we shared with you all kind of a prettier version of what we had to submit to the Federal Highway Administration. With the midterm report that we have to do this coming October 1, we have an opportunity to adjust our 4-year targets, but we're also going to have to report out on how we are in our current performance relative to any 2-year targets that were achieved or are not being achieved, and then what's going to be done to address that. And then if we're making those adjustments to 4-year targets, why we were making those adjustments. As we noted during the safety presentation that I gave and information that we provided to you, FHWA will also make a determination of significant progress for our 2-year target. I don't have information yet on the time frame of when that information will be available to us, but it's basically going to be similar again to the safety program, such that if we're not achieving targets, we're going to have to document actions that we're taking to ensure that we do achieve our targets. And then depending on the measure, there may have some funding or other reporting impacts. And generally with the funding impacts, those are related to our bridges and pavements that are in poor condition, and the penalties for safety that we highlighted to you all earlier. Just right off the top, we are not at risk relative to any funding penalties because our poor condition for pavements and bridges are in good shape, as you'll see in the next slide and our next few slides. Next slide, please. So these are the performance measures we use for the asset condition. So we're really focused on the good and poor condition of our pavements and bridges. Both of these measures for the pavements and bridges are limited to the National Highway System, and then for the bridges, it's the National Bridge Inventory that's also on the National Highway System. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges or just kind of the points about the federal measures that really, in focusing only on the National Highway System, it's such a limited portion of the network for which VDOT is responsible for. So you've got a little tip of the iceberg there. It's approximately 15% between both pavements and bridges. And the measures really do only relate to good and poor condition. I think if you all will recall back last fall, you all received several presentations from the commissioner, and there's a lot of focus also on fair bridges and cuss bridges. So the measures from the federal perspective are a little bit more narrow in their focus. When we first set our targets back in 2018, the targets were really based on some trend analysis that we had done at the time, and then a significant modeling that comes from the pavement management system and the bridge system. So a lot of work went into trying to establish our initial targets. You all took action on those targets back in September of 2018 and adopted targets at that time. Next slide. Before getting into kind of how we're doing and where we are relative to targets, I wanted to refresh and remind everybody on the work that was done in 2019. So if you'll recall, there was legislative action through an enactment clause requiring VDOT to conduct a detailed analysis of its long-term sustainability for the pavements, bridges, and special structures. And that really focused on the network that is funded and maintained by VDOT, and it included the state of good repair programs, not just the maintenance and operation funding programs. And then as far as the roadway network that it looked at, we really focused a lot on the interstate primary and secondary systems, and many of the targets and measures are set at those networks instead of just the NHS. As a result of that effort, and I believe it's a presentation that was given to you in September or October of 2019, Certain new measures were proposed for pavements and bridges, such that pavements would be measured utilizing a critical condition index and the percent sufficiency. And then they added in some thresholds based on the volume of traffic for both the primary and secondary roads. For the bridge measures, a measure was proposed to utilize a general condition rating and the percent not structurally deficient. So focusing again more broadly on the condition of the structures, not just our good and fair as that kind of rating system. And as a result of all that and the information that you all received, really looked at modifying the investment strategy so that it was more comprehensive and balanced approach to asset management. And then last December, you all adopted both those new measures and targets for the entire network, or the VDOT maintained network, rather than just the NHS, so statewide performance measures and targets. And really the thought that we would utilize those sorts of targets and measures to help drive our investment decisions, not utilizing the federal measures for that same purpose. Next slide, please. So how are we doing? So these again are focused on the how are we doing slides on the next few slides are really focused on just the federal measures. So it's not the statewide measures that you all adopted in December. So for our good, we can see that it's somewhat flat, but generally, I guess just flat when you start looking into the timeline. But you can see that we have improved our core performance. So in general, the blue bars we would want to see increase, the red line we would want to see decrease. So this slide is for the interstate system. The next slide, please. Is the same information, but now we're looking at the non-interstate NHS. And so again, good performance, relatively flat, no major changes, maybe a slight decline. And again, blue would probably be an improvement. Red would be the red line going down is where we would prefer, and we're relatively flat there. Next slide, please. So now we look at what targets you all actually took action on in 2018. You can see our 2-year and our 4-year targets for each of these measures, and then provided you with our performance for 3 years of performance. And then the final column in this table just kind of gives you a sense of whether, how are we doing relative to that target, and if we're meeting that target or not. So what is our trend showing us, and are we in good shape? So bottom line is based on the targets that were adopted, our performance is trending in generally the right direction, and we are meeting the targets for all 4 of these measures. So next slide, please. So with the pavement asset condition performance measures and the work that we did through the comprehensive review, the new modified investment strategies, we think that it's very, that there's no need to change our 4-year target, that they can still be achieved given those current or moving forward those investment strategies that are planned. So no changes to the CTB adopted 4-year target is proposed for our pavement measures. Any questions before I move to bridge? All right, next slide, please. So for the bridge performance, we've got 2 graphics here. So this first one is focused on the good condition, and the second one is focused on the poor condition. And you'll see kind of a blip in 2018 where the line drops significantly here in a good chart and kind of turns to a darker color green. And what occurred there is when we first started really managing and maintaining a database and system and monitoring our performance on the bridge performance, we were focused more on the VDOT maintained system. The federal measures require us to include federally owned bridges as well as border bridges, and those all have to be included in our data analysis. So beginning in 2018, we added that to our data set, and you can see that a little bit of a drop in performance there, but still, and with a slight trending in going down for our performance for good structures. And I'll speak a little bit more about that in a moment, but let's move to the next slide, which is the poor performance. And so same thing, that when we added in our adjustment for the border and federal bridges, we can see a little shift in our trend lines. However, we can still see that it has generally declined and we're in pretty good shape here. Across the top of the chart here, there is a dashed line that reflects a 10% federal minimum for the performance target, such that every state should be striving to be below 10% that are considered in poor condition. So we're well below that number at this point in time. So trending pretty well here. So the next slide, please. So here's a similar chart that you saw for pavements, where we presented to you the targets that you all adopted in 2018, our trends with performance, actual data, and then kind of how we're doing relative to the trend line and to the target achievement. And so what we saw even in the trend line chart is that we are trending downward in bridges that are not quite in as good a condition, but however, we're doing well on our poor condition bridges. Just a note here, you can see at the bottom of this chart here, so the data that's reflected in this table, for example, the 2017 data, there's a lag in the data that gets reported and approved by FHWA, so the charts are off by 1 year, so the 2017 data in this chart would be the 2018 data that's reflected in the graphic. So just to kind of understand that there's a little bit of a lag of the data used for the chart development. Next slide.
Margie, Ms. Chairman,
Yes.
Chairman, can you go back to that slide? Previous slide. I'm not, what am I not understanding? I think I'm interpreting this backwards. The deck area of the bridge is in good condition. Our target is 33.5. All right, so,
Correct.
okay, so we're below the target of good condition. And
Right.
then the deck area of bridges in poor condition is 3.5. Okay, we're 3.1. I got it. I don't know what I was thinking.
Yeah, it's reversed. So yes, it's a little difficult sometimes to understand.
Let me ask you another question, which goes back to the slide on pavements, which is, if we're not going to, if I came to you right now and said, well, we're not meeting our targets, so let's lower them, you would say I was crazy, and I would be. But in performance of payments, we're substantially exceeding our targets, but we don't change them. Are we happy with the targets when we can do much better and are doing much better, or should the targets reflect what we think we can do and ought to do? Because we're doing so much better than those targets, but we leave them the same place.
I think that's a great question. And certainly as we even look at setting the initial targets, pardon me, did somebody else say something? So when we first set targets, we did look at things as, when we set our targets, do we want something that is kind of a stretch? Do we want it to be realistic? And so there's a lot of thought given to that. And the other part of this, though, it really comes down to the how FHWA is measuring it versus how VDOT is measuring it. And so we measure many distresses on the roadway. FHWA's measure only requires us to report out on 4 of those distresses. So that's one little piece of this as far as just kind of looking at where we are. Target versus performance certainly makes a difference there. But I think in looking at where our investment strategies are and focusing on the large majority of the network rather than a small portion of the network, we did give that some consideration, because at times we may need to invest more into the non-NHS portion of the network, secondary roads, things like that, such that it might impact our performance on the interstate or non-interstate NHS.
Understood.
So I think there was some thought given to that.
Understood.
And Madam Chair, Mr. Miller, to Ms. Ray's point, this is Nick. I think, and I'm actually speaking up to get somebody else to speak up. Commissioner, this was a part of your comprehensive review. So, Mr. Miller, I think part of what the commissioner did last fall was take a look at, we are dramatically exceeding our targets. Are these sustainable levels of performance, and what is sustainable long term? So again, the feds, as Ms. Ray said, have a short-term focus. But I think what the department has tried to do, and I think the commissioner really should be commended for, was putting in place what we thought was a sustainable level of performance over the long term, looking at kind of the life cycle, particularly on pavements, which, don't last nearly as long as bridges. And so I think that's another reason why we're not advocating to increase the target. Is I think when we look out over the long term, this is where we think we will be sustainably where we can sustain performance based on how things are working today, as the commissioner kind of laid out last year, and which was an impetus for part of how we restructured and put some of the funding in the omnibus legislation, which did increase funding levels for pavements to help us achieve that long-term sustainable targets, which are reflected in some of the things Ms. Ray's presented today.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Donohue. Okay, next slide, please. So with the bridge good performance condition, we are proposing a change to the target from 33.0 to 30.5 for that 4-year target. And on my next slide, I've got some of the discussion too around why we think a change is necessary and why maybe we didn't achieve the target the first go round. So next slide, please. So when we look back to say, why didn't we achieve a certain level of performance that was that we had projected back in 2018? I showed you all the slide deck where the trend lines added in the federal data and the border bridges. And so when we first started looking at our targets, we made some assumptions that maybe the federally owned bridges and the border bridges were in similar condition to Virginia. That was before we had access to all of the data when we were first trying to establish those targets. What we observed is that some of their bridges are not in as good a condition, so that brought it down a little bit. Then we also, through all of our program areas, we continue to struggle with and improve our data quality. And so I think that there were some identified inconsistencies in the data that we've since have improved. And every time we go through another round of this stuff, we continue to improve. And so, in theory, and in hindsight, we probably would have set our targets a little differently had we had better information back in 2018. And so I think right now we're well positioned moving forward. The other thing too that we've looked at is, in trying to adjust a target, are we in a good place there too? Well, let me go back here to the real point of the second bullet is that part of our strategy prior to the comprehensive review was really focusing on reduction of our core bridges. And so one, there's a limitation of how the state of good repair funding can be used and that it can only be used for those structurally deficient bridges. And a lot of the bridges that we did replace over the last few years were focused more on the non-NHS routes. They didn't influence and affect our federal measure. We're also continuing to focus on the preservation, restoration, and rehab of those fair and poor bridges, not necessarily the good bridges. So we really think this target adjustment helps align with our current and best information, and certainly in line with what we're trying to accomplish through the work that was done as part of that comprehensive review. Next slide, please.
Madam Chairman, Nick and Margie, the last line in that slide just really bothers me. It's sort of, I understand the data piece. I understand that we didn't have exactly what we needed. I understand all that, and I think that's legitimate in terms of changing targets. But when I say I'm going to change my target to be equal to the best I think I can do, that.
Mr. Miller, can I jump in? I understand your exception to that language, and I think that line perhaps could be worded differently. I think what I would say is we are recommending an adjustment of the target to take into account the things that were not previously in there. We are not just saying we've fallen down, we're there, we added in these new bridges we didn't have, that brought us down, and some other things. So I understand your exception. I wish I would have thought about it that way before we put this out there, and we will not characterize it that way in the future.
Thank you very much.
Madam Secretary.
Yes.
I'd just like to jump in on a couple of these points. Certainly a good conversation to be had. I think Margie's done an excellent job in trying to present the difference between the state performance measures and those that are required at the federal level. Certainly his slide is indicative of some of the things or a number of the items that were not taken into consideration in 2018 when we set the federal performance measures that needed to be had. Certainly being accountable for federally owned bridges and those bridges that are on our borders that in some cases are very significant. Woodrow Wilson Bridge, American Legion Bridge, the Nice Bridge, and others that we have abutting Maryland and elsewhere. So certainly that is an impact to our bridge performance. But I'll take it back to what Margie had started off with, is that the tip of the iceberg is certainly the national highway system bridges, and not necessarily the full cadre of the 20,000 bridges that we have through the state, or the 120,000 lane miles that we have in our pavement system. So I think as we go through this and try and align our performance measures and relate the state performance measures that are adequately set and are in a sustainable fashion, we're going to work with the federal government to continue to modify their procedures to become much more in line with industry standard. The issue of deck area performance is one that we're trying to get changed, and I think is going to be an obsolete performance measure as we move forward, and will become, in our process that we're looking at preservation first, cusp bridges, and those items are going to become much more imperative as we continue to move forward. I think, as Margie's indicated, that the vast majority, as we focused on bridges outside of the NHS system for the last several years on structural deficiency, this is one indicator that the national highway system bridges show a decrease in their overall performance. They are still safe. They are, and I do need to say that while this performance may indicate that there's a degradation, those bridges are still safe. I would post them or close them if I felt at any point in time that they were not safe. So the full picture, this is the issue that I think we're contending with, is we're trying to present the picture that's required at the federal level and meet the federal requirements. But from the global perspective of the state, our bridges are safe, secure, and are in line with the performance metrics that the board adopted back in December of 2019 as we finished up the comprehensive review. I will remind the board that we intend to come back in the September timeframe to be able to give that comprehensive review for pavements and bridges, as well as our routine maintenance, to be able to show what we have adopted in the fall. So we had a planned activity and then an actual, and we indicated at that time we'd come back on an annual basis to present just that. How are we measuring up to what we said we were going to do on an annual basis? So that's going to be a presentation that is currently being prepared for the board at its September meeting, and we'll highlight how we are doing on 100% of the inventory for our bridges as well as our pavement system.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Yes, thank you. So the next slide gets into some of the assumptions that were made in this analysis, and respectfully from the perspective that you had, Mr. Miller, of really, it's not trying to move toward a minimum, it's trying to move to what we think that we can do through an investment strategy. But there were certain assumptions that went into this analysis for our four-year target for our good conditions. And one is that funding continues at current levels. We have several large and design build and P3 projects that are underway with bridges that will be entering the inventory. And so right now their construction completion dates, again, if you'll recall, the four-year targets run through calendar year 2021. So as long as those projects stay on track, they'll likely help us improve our good deck area percentages. So those are very helpful and important to stay on track for that purpose. But also that our bridge deterioration rates stay at those historical trends that we've observed to date. So those are just some of the key aspects of what we looked at when we considered adjusting the target for 4 years. The next slide, please. This kind of goes back to that statewide perspective and the comprehensive review and some of the assumptions that were included in that. So this gets to that overall management of the system, not just focusing on the federal portion that we're required to for those federal measures. One of the things that I believe that the commissioner just said is that we are looking at through this long-term sustainable program and outcome that we are anticipating a general decline of good performance, and that's how we'll be able to influence that and improve all of our structures. With the pavement program, one thing there is that it was identified that additional investment was needed to really achieve the new statewide measures and targets that were adopted. And so legislation was passed and signed by the governor into law that does anticipates providing additional funding for pavements and special structures. So that should help ensure that we can achieve positive outcomes. The Brich program, as they did their analysis, part of the comprehensive review, did not identify that there was an increase in funding necessary. What it did request or suggest that was necessary was a change to the State of Good Repair Code language, because right now there's constraints on how that money can be utilized because it limits it to the use for the reconstruction and replacement of structurally deficient bridges and the reconstruction and rehabilitation of deteriorated pavements on only the interstate and primary systems. And so I think there's some additional flexibility that would be helpful to help address some of those cuss bridges, which right now can only be funded through the Highway Maintenance and Operating Fund. So we'll continue to see probably a decline on the good bridges on the NHS until we can start doing some of this. But also, I guess just a point there too, back to the legislation change, is there was not a change made in the 2020 General Assembly session. And so ideally and moving forward, we would look to seek a change to the legislation to provide additional flexibility in the use of the State of Good Repair funding. Next slide, please.
Madam Secretary. Margie, could I ask a question, please?
Yes, sir.
I'm going to apologize to the group. For whatever reason, when I'm touching my screen to mute and unmute, it takes 2 or 3 times to actually make it go through. So I'm right here. I just am not able to unmute sometimes fast enough. So I'm sorry, Mr. Whitworth. Please proceed.
Madam Secretary, you can try the space bar. It's quicker.
Well, we're just glad you're interested. Margie, why is it that MAP 21 delegates to states their ability to set criteria for what is acceptable? Why wouldn't that be a national criteria, especially involving national highway systems? Do states have different criteria that would show that one of our bridges would be unacceptable in another state given the same condition?
Mr. Whitworth, thanks for that question. Let me clarify. The MAP 21 federal measures are required by all states. Every state must use those same measures. Not every state, though, has the same responsibility that Virginia does. So in Virginia, being the 3rd largest DOT, we manage and maintain so much of the network. Not every state has that or does that. So that's where we felt it was important, and through that comprehensive review was establishment of statewide measures that are different from the federal measures. So the federal measures is only about 15% of what VDOT is responsible for. But again, that is a national standard that all states are responding to and preparing targets and addressing those things. So it's a national standard. It's only Virginia that has now created something to address the rest of our network.
Well, are our roads comparable to other states' roads as far as the same standards?
Ms. Ray, Mr. Whitworth, if I may, this is Nick Donohue. So, Mr. Whitworth, as Ms. Ray was indicating, in MAP 21, there was, for the first time ever, the requirement that the United States Department of Transportation develop a set of performance measures. And so all states use this exact same criteria as they determine what bridges are considered good, or what bridge deck area, excuse me, is considered in good condition versus in poor. Where states have the discretion is in the target they choose to set for each of those measures. But if you're asking, is the definition of bridge deck area in each state for good the same? The answer is yes. What differs and where the states have discretion, and this was a topic of significant discussion in 2011 and 12 when MAP 21 was enacted, was whether states should set the targets for themselves or whether there should be some sort of national standard. Ultimately, at that time, and it was a divided Congress, so the outcome was to have a broader set of performance standards and measures that states would be required to use, but to have states retain the flexibility to establish those standards that they thought were best. And then the further part of the compromise was that USDOT would monitor and track, and they have made the decision to report this data so that nationally people do have the ability to look at whether states are making progress against where they previously were and are meeting their own targets, but also to compare states to each other, which if you talk to some folks, they would say that is not the intent of these measures, but that is something that has been done as this data is reported on USDOT's website.
Well, do we communicate with other states or have knowledge of what their targets are in considering ours?
There's extensive communication between the states, both through STASHTO and ASHTO, which are national and regional associations of state DOTs. We also, through the Transportation Research Board, have done coordinating events with neighboring states. So I think we did one with North Carolina DOT, and we've done it with other folks to talk about what are some of their best practices when it comes to setting targets, what are some of our best practices, and we try and kind of learn from each other on those items. I do want to note, though, that as Ms. Ray indicated, or the commissioner, I forget who it was, we are unique when it comes to the majority of other state DOTs with regard to the scope and breadth of our responsibility for maintaining roadways. In most states, it's really kind of just what we would call the primary network and the interstate network that the state is responsible for. And the rest of those roads tend to be considered local and are maintained by, in most cases, those counties and towns and cities, whereas in Virginia, we maintain the vast majority of local streets. There's only a few other DOTs that have that kind of same breadth here. And so that's why our comprehensive pavement review is, they were kind of trying to note the distinction there between that and this national highway system. The federal government tends to have restrictions and different funding programs depending on whether a road is or is not located on the national highway system. And that was they expanded that system in MAP 21 as well.
Thank you.
Madam Secretary, Mr. Whitworth, just to follow up on the question, do we have contact with other states in establishing our performance measures? I call the board's attention back to a number of the presentations that we did in support of both the pavement and the bridge performance. We did undertake a significant literature review and contacts with other states, including our neighboring states, North Carolina, as well as Texas, when we did establish the pavement performance targets and bridge performance targets. They do continue to vary on a percentage basis, similar to what we have done. But to directly answer your question, yes, we do have significant discussions with them on what are appropriate performance targets. But it's left to each individual state to be able to establish their own levels of performance. What we saw was that there is wide variability throughout the nation in establishing those performance targets, inclusive of down to the primary and the secondary system, which we have control over. So large network of contacts that we have, and certainly have presented those pieces of information back to the board prior to us adopting the findings from the comprehensive review back in December.
Okay.
All right, thank you for those questions and clarity. I'm now shifting gears away from the asset condition side, and we're moving to a system performance set of measures, which are focused on reliability, congestion, and air quality. And so you can see that we have several measures that are focused on reliability for both person miles traveled as well as trucks or freight movement. We also look at peak hour of excessive delay and the percentage of non-SOV travel. And then from an air quality perspective, we look at both our volatile organic compounds and the nitrogen oxides. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So these next couple slides focus on the reliability measures. So this is the measure that is the percent of person miles traveled that are considered reliable. And it's this is focused only on both the interstate and the non-interstate NHS. So it's a little bit limited in its network. And it is a measure that is looking at the ratio of the travel time to the 80th percentile versus the 50th percentile, such that to arrive on time 80% of the time, one would need to budget 50% more time to a typical trip. We look at 4 different time periods for this measure, as you can see on the slide there. And a segment is deemed reliable only if all 4 time periods are considered reliable, and the threshold used for reliability is 1.5. And so this is a little bit of a dated map, but we can just kind of get a sense of much of our network based on this criteria is considered reliable. So the next slide moves into the truck travel time reliability index. So this is an index, and now they've added an additional time period to this. So it's 5 time periods with the overnight for all days. And really the goal for this measure is to help improve that reliability for the trucking industry and really providing that opportunity for better on-time delivery. And in this measure, we're looking at the ratio of the truck travel time for the 95th percentile over the 50th percentile. And so in also this, we're looking at, you look at the worst time period, and that's what's identifying whether you're using that to sum your truck travel time reliability index across the network. This measure is limited to the interstate only. And so it's looking at that worst segment though. So next slide, please. So one of the things back in 2018, I believe Nick actually gave you a presentation, started talking a little bit about the construct of these measures. And I think that we have some challenges and concerns about how the federal measure works and how we can really utilize that to help understand what's happening on our network. So, first of all, we've got that point that really kind of the converse of what I said a moment ago is that everything is considered reliable or unreliable if just only one of your 4 time periods is unreliable. For the truck period, you're using your worst time period. And so, I might have one roadway segment where I have 1 time period that is unreliable versus another roadway segment where maybe all 4 of my time periods are unreliable. My strategy for improving that roadway segment might be very different based on what the problem really is. So the measure doesn't really give us that visibility into what is occurring on the roadway. We are looking at time periods that may not really represent the peak travel conditions. For example, the peak travel in Richmond tends to probably be an hour in length, whereas you go up in Northern Virginia and it might be several hours. That kind of masks a little bit of what the problem might be as well. We also see that there's some sensitivity issues. So if I've got a reliability of 3.2, which would be pretty bad, but then I do a significant investment and I improve it to a reliability index of 1.7, I'm still going to be considered unreliable, even though I have improved reliability. So I think there's a lot of things with this measure that, we're using one number to reflect this across the entire state as well on an annual basis. So I think there's just some challenges with that measure. I've got some other points about where we're going with some of this down the line. But let's see how we're doing. So the next slide gets into our performance. Now, one of the challenges with this data set is that beginning in 2017, there's a source of data that we were somewhat obligated to use through Federal Highway Administration. So we didn't have a long history of data to be able to really look at our trends and understand it. So basically, we're creating trends off of 3 data points right now. And so sometimes that can create some challenges. But when we look at our measures here for our reliability on the interstate and the non-interstate with person miles traveled that are reliable, in both of those measures, we are improving our trends and we're meeting those targets. So we're looking pretty good there. We are having what we call challenging on our truck travel time reliability index. We can see that it kind of bounces around a little bit just through those 3 data points. And so, really it's, we still think that given where we are, that there's no change necessary for a 4-year target right now. But the next measure is the peak hour of excessive delay per capita. So same thing there in that it, I didn't really speak much about this one, but this is when the travel speed is less than 20 miles per hour or 60% of the posted speed. So that's the definition of excessive delay. And so it is looking at the peak hour on a per capita basis. And again, target is showing that we are meeting our target. The last measure there, though, is that percentage of non-SOV travel. So this is our single occupancy vehicles. The source of this data comes from the American Community Survey and gets updated annually through the census data. So right now we are noting that there's not really any change or improvement or decline in the data per se. There's a significant lag in when data becomes available for this performance measure. We actually won't have the 2019 data to be able to report out on until October of this year, the fall of this year. So currently we're not meeting the target. This measure and the annual hours of peak hour excessive delay measure are ones where we have to work with the National Capital Region, TPB, to establish the targets and agree to the methodology, because those measures are limited to Northern Virginia only as part of the air quality measures, in a sense, because they are targeted towards those areas of a certain population that have been a maintenance or non-attainment area for air quality. So with these measures, working with TPB, we're also having to work with Maryland and DC DOTs, in addition to the NPO region up there, to identify what the methodology is for setting the target and then actual target setting. So next slide, please. I wanted to focus a little bit first on just kind of the discussion around our reliability measures and the, where we are with that. So noted that the non-SOV travel performance measures not meeting the targets. Currently, we're not proposing changes to any of the other measures for the reliability or the peak hour of excessive delay. One of the challenges we've had here in understanding the data is not just that there's limited availability as far as time. We've also seen some inconsistencies in the data and the mapping. And some of this may only be small changes, but it can alter the direction of the trend. So it's been very difficult for our team to really utilize that with great confidence. What we have noted, though, already in a couple of years, there's a significant improvement in the data quality, and that variability that we see in the data is decreasing. So that we do think that that's going to continue to improve, such that this will be a better measure for us to use as well. We haven't had the ability to really understand the trends with no historical context, and to that point again of just data availability and variability. Next slide, please. So with the reliability measures, I think it's really important to understand kind of where we're going with that. These are measures that we've actually spent a lot of time looking at. You saw through Ben's presentation on the I-64 corridor how they looked at some things with reliability and congestion. And so I think one of the important things to understand is that, you know, VDOT does regularly monitor and actively manage its incidents to help improve that, the work zones, other events, so that we're minimizing travel time impacts and improving that variability. And then through regular review of the performance measures, our operations personnel, they can redirect our resources and change policies to reduce the impact of the non-recurring delay. Since congestion reliability measures are also used to help prioritize our smart scale projects, we're working to affect positive change in reliability performance measures with those capital investments. And then additionally, going back to the work that Ben referenced earlier, and through all the other corridor studies and identification of those proposed improvements, those should also help affect positive change. So again, this measure, I highlighted and flagged a little bit of some of the challenges we find with it. We think we've spent a lot of time trying to work with the existing federal measure to understand how we could utilize it to understand investment strategies and to improve our outcomes. We actually even looked at creating some new measures to help us get there. So that's just significant work in progress. There is a lot of research underway, both in Virginia and nationally, to better understand those causes of unreliable conditions and understanding those investment strategies that can improve it. You know, is it an operational improvement or a capacity project that might need to be done? But also better understanding that when we have performance changes, why? That's kind of difficult to understand. Was it because there was a work zone, or is it because we implemented more safety service patrols? We want to be able to better predict future performance. You all saw through the safety work that we spent a lot of time being able to predict what might happen in the future. We haven't yet been able to get to that point with our reliability measures, but I think that in the not too distant future we'll be much better positioned to do so. We are still looking at other measures which may be more reflective of those desired outcomes. We're looking at using, just through the various work that's being done through VTrans, those corridor studies, this sort of work. There are a lot of measures that can tell a story, and so I think we want to understand what story are we trying to tell, what problem are we trying to solve, and making sure that we're using those measures that help us understand whether we've been able to influence that outcome. All right, next slide, please. Going back to that non-SOV travel measure, currently, as I noted before, we're not achieving the target. We've been in communication with the MPO up in the DC area, TPB, and kind of talked to them about reasons why we don't think that we're achieving that target. So first of all, some of the way the target was set was through looking at some trend analysis and extrapolating out into the future, but then also using their travel demand model and using certain assumptions on various factors of growth or decline. So, increases in population, increases in employment, things like that that would influence the future and certainly influence how people might commute. So some of the observations that they had is that, the gas prices have fallen, stayed low, and so people are still driving more. Car ownership is up, particularly in those low-income households, and so they have access to at least one vehicle. And while we observe some trends in public ridership, we're recovering from the last recession, they're still been below what the projections were, and certainly what we've seen on some of the transit systems. I think we've had some really great news with some of the transit systems this last year, and so we were starting to see some improvements, but still not quite achieving what we had anticipated and projected for achievement of these targets. The other aspect of this is through all of our TNC and the ride-hailing services that they are affecting our transit ridership. And those drivers might also be adding to our single occupants in vehicles while they're driving around in between customer pickups. So one of the things here is that in communication with them, this measure does need to be established, or the target needs to be established in coordination with Maryland, DC, and the TPB. And I think we've already had a little bit of a conversation about COVID-19 and the impact on travel and transit ridership and commuters and things like that. And there's so many changes right now that I know that there's some hesitancy to make adjustments right now, given a lack of understanding of the full impact of COVID-19. And so I know that we're still having some conversations with the TPB to decide what we think we ought to do, and then our plan would be to come back to you about that. So right now, we're not recommending any changes to the target, even though we're not currently meeting the target. Next slide, please. So the last couple of measures are focused on air quality, and these are the congestion mitigation, air quality, emissions reduction measures. And in Virginia, these criteria for pollutants are the volatile organic compounds and the nitrogen oxides. This only applies in Northern Virginia, and the measures, the targets here are the measures and the targets are a little bit different here in that they're based on the total emissions reduction, and it's a cumulative for the 2 and the 4 year time periods. Again, Virginia had to work with Maryland, DC, and the TPB to establish a methodology for developing the targets and agree to those targets. So just as a quick reminder, This is focused only on those projects that are funded using the CMAQ funding. And next slide, please. And so just wanted to share kind of how are we doing. We can see just through the bar chart that we have trended downward generally from 2014 and up to 2019. So the reductions have improved. So our air quality is improving. The types of projects, next slide, please, that Virginia utilized in establishing its baseline conditions are reflective in this slide. So you can kind of see largely a lot of them are the bicycle and pedestrian type projects, congestion and traffic flow having the largest impacts. So one thing about this measure as well is that Virginia really is contributing to most of the proposed reductions compared to Maryland and DC, because just the types of projects that we've selected and are funding through CMAQ are a little bit more impactful. So we're doing quite well there. So next slide. So with our performance here, we can see what the targets were that were adopted back in 2018. The baseline columns represent the average, the emissions reductions for that time period in the chart that I just showed you as far as what the cumulative or total emissions should be. And then our performance for the next 3 years is provided there. And in all cases, we are improving and meeting the targets. So no changes to targets are proposed for the air quality measures. Next slide, please. So really what looking for as far as some next steps is providing us some feedback on the target adjustments, and currently the only target that we're proposing to change to is the deck area in good condition for bridges. What I mentioned a moment ago is that coming back to you all with any potential target adjustments for the % of non-SOV travel. I think additional dialogue is needed with Maryland, DC, and the TPB. Based on the timing of when the baseline, the midterm performance report is due on October 1, it's our intent to bring back the proposed targets at the next meeting for you all to adopt before we can finalize our report. I didn't speak about it a lot today, but I mean, obviously, we've already brought up that there are impacts to COVID-19, and I think it's going to be important for us to understand the impacts to travel and how that might impact both our adopted targets and how it affects our performance. You know, Jitender spoke about it within the framework of his the VTrans efforts, and you know, taking that time right now to evaluate that. So I think there'll be some opportunity for us to do that and being able to report back to you on how we think that might affect our performance. Also, we did have some legislative changes that provide some more funding for like pavement programs. And so I think we need to understand, given some of the changes to our funding programs as well, how that impacts us in moving forward and implementing the new legislation. Any more questions?
Anybody from the board?
Secretary,
Yes.
is Virginia under any danger of federal sanction, funding loss, anything else with regard to our performance on these standards?
Margie, do you want to take that?
Yeah, Madam Secretary, no, we are not at risk for losing any funding for not achieving performance.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, Margie, thank you so much. Gosh, that was a lot of work. And anyway, very grateful to you for that and to the entire team. I am going to propose that we break at this point. It is 11:47. A few of us have a meeting that we need to participate in. And I am going to ask that we come back, we reconvene at 1 o'clock. Okay, with that, Carol, is there anything that needs to be done?
No, we're just going to suspend the meeting and we'll call to order when we reconvene at 1.
Okay, thank you. Okay, hello, everybody. We are back. Is everybody with us?
Gang's all here.
Is the gang all here? Good.
Gang's here.
Okay, well, listen, thank you all so much. We are going to be doing something today that is a little bit unusual, but I think it's important. We're going to pull from the presentation today the master tolling agreement update. The contract, there have been negotiations going on for a long time regarding the contract. The final draft was actually sent around to all of us last night or late yesterday. And we want to make sure that all of you have a chance to review the resolution as well as the contract. And so we will be actually calling a meeting of all of us to actually address that one issue, the tolling contract and the resolution, hopefully in the coming days. And we'll try to set it at a time that will be amenable to all of you. But it's an important document, and I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to actually sign off. So with that, we will continue with our workshop. And Director Mitchell, do you have anything to add at this time?
Just a few quick notes that we are starting to see more increases in transit service and transit ridership. Over the past few months, we've had a number of systems that are starting to increase service again as we're starting to see more people going back to work. Some of those systems include PRTC up in Northern Virginia, Arlington Transit, Loudoun County, Hampton Roads Transit, Greensville County, and Chincoteague, along with some of our demand response systems across the state as well. We also have a number of systems that are continuing to go fare-free, such as GRTC in Richmond and Blacksburg. GLTC in Lynchburg has also announced they'll continue to go fare-free until at least through August. So overall, we had seen transit ridership actually up as of February. We were up 2% compared to the same period last year. Obviously, that's started to decline since then. And then in May, our transit ridership was about 84% of where it was in May of last year. But as I mentioned before, people are starting to go back to work in phase 3, and we're starting to see those trends change a little bit. VRE has also seen some of their ridership increasing as well, although it's still substantially down from where it was at this point last year, but it grew by about 40% over the past week. And in general, our Amtrak ridership as well is starting to improve. System-wide, Amtrak ridership is up 15% compared to where it was last month. It's now about 23% of last year's ridership levels. But they are continuing to add service and add trains, particularly for social distancing. And overall, our ridership compared to this time last year is about 84% of where it was in the state. And that concludes my report.
Thank you, Jennifer. Commissioner Brich.
Madam Secretary, I'll dovetail right into Jennifer's presentation or update that she just gave, that we continue to monitor the traffic projections and conditions that we have. We continue to allow our contractors and our paving contractors to be able to have additional daytime closures, recognizing that our traffic volumes are not to the same levels as they were pre-COVID. But I will say that looking at our volumes, our truck volumes are back to pre-COVID levels, and in some cases a little bit higher. But our traffic is about rebounded to the point where it's about 85 to 90% back to pre-COVID levels. So in our next meeting, anticipate a September meeting, we will give a similar presentation as that we gave to the board back in May, documenting what those levels are in each of the districts. So that'll be a September presentation. But again, we're at 85 to 90%, and you'll recognize on some weekend traffic, especially in the Fredericksburg district, we are back to levels that were experienced last year. With that being said, and as we continue to reopen, governor's announced the phase 3 reopening. The department is looking at reopening its facilities, looking at telework opportunities, continuing that. We're going to present back to the board a lot of the lessons learned that we took away from quickly entering the telework phase, and how we were able to accomplish this and really continue to fire on all cylinders that we had. So we're going to have a lesson learned presentation for you all at the September workshop meeting, talking about how we were able to accomplish the telework, how we were able to accomplish our day-to-day activities without missing a beat. So those are just really the two updates that I have for the board today.
Oh, thank you. And for the board, the teams continue to work very diligently through all the budget issues, through contract issues, preparing budget amendments for what we believe will be a special session in August, and then a reforecasting of our budgets. So we continue to make that a high priority. I will tell you that we continue to make milestones working through the CSX negotiations. And yesterday I had the opportunity to testify on HR 7489. It was a bill in Congress that was introduced by Congressman Whitman, co-sponsored by Congressman Beyer, supported by the entire bipartisan delegation of Virginia, along with Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton from DC and Congressman Anthony Brown from Maryland. And that was actually working through an important step that we need to finalize on the National Park Service having the authority to convey land to the Commonwealth of Virginia and the District of Columbia in order to build a rail bridge across federal lands. Today, highways can do that. The National Park Service has that authority. And so this is something that Congressman Whitman did a great job yesterday of explaining. We tried to find every way to manage this without needing legislation in Congress. We tried to do it administratively. This is the route that we need to take. I believe that the hearing went very well. I believe the word was called no-brainer. So hopefully everything will continue to move forward. We are in the HR2 transportation bill as well. And Senators Warner, Kane, and Von Hollen are also working with similar language in the Senate. So we have a multifaceted approach to getting this done, but did want to let you know about that. And it's anticipated, according to Congressman Whitman, that this would be on the floor of the House possibly next week. So with that, I will adjourn the workshop, and we will enter into the action items. And Carol Mathis, do we also have a reading from Mr. Whitworth at this time?
Sure do.
Well, I knew you would be ready, Mr. Whitworth, so I turn it over to you.
Yes, ma'am. In light of the continuing state of emergency declared by Governor Northam, where it is impractical or unsafe to assemble a quorum in a single location, I move that we adopt this agenda to take action to discuss or transact the business statutorily required or necessary to continue operation of the Commonwealth Transportation Board.
Second.
Got to be fast, Allison.
I never can beat Shep to a microphone.
So true, so true. Any further discussion? All those in favor or opposition? Carol Mathis will call the roll.
Mr. Rucker,
Aye.
Mr. Stinson,
Aye.
Mr. Brown, Mr. Kasprowitz, Mr. Malbin,
Aye.
Mr. Tunk,
Aye.
Mr. Whitworth,
Aye.
Mr. Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Yates,
Aye.
Mr. Miller,
Aye.
Ms. Hines,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Dodson,
Yay.
Mr. Smoot.
Aye.
Motion passed. The roll's complete.
Thank you, Carol. I appreciate that. Do we have anyone signed up for public comment?
We do. We have one person signed up for public comment.
And so would you please make that introduction?
Madam Secretary, members of the board, this time there's one caller on the line. That's Mike Cobb. Mike, if you're on the line, you're welcome to address the board.
Thank you ever so much, Madam Secretary and members of the board.
Welcome.
My name is Michael Cobb, and I am the retired curator of the Hampton History Museum and the leader of the Coalition for Historic Fort Wool. We have formed the Coalition for Historic Fort Wool to seek a return of Fort Wool to the prior status of historic site open to the public visitation. We also seek the physical rehabilitation and improvement of the dock, single tower, and casemates. We are deeply disturbed about the Commonwealth's hasty action earlier this year to convert historic Fort Wool to a sanctuary for nesting migratory birds to accommodate the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel expansion project. We are concerned about the level and the quality of review conducted of this action by the responsible federal and state agencies, and would note no one even raised Fort Wool's historic importance or economic contribution to the region. In VDOT or DGIF's presentation to you last March, basically the governor's office had agreed to convert Fort Wool to a nesting bird sanctuary in mid-February, and everyone then fell into line. That was then, and this is now. What we seek is a binding commitment by the Commonwealth to restore Fort Wool to its prior status of a historic site open to public visitation. While we strongly disagree with the DCR's consultant's memorandum report of March 2, that the fort should not be open to the public visitation for safety reasons, we also seek the physical rehabilitation and improvement of its dock, single tower, and casemates. Today, we wanted to inform you of our existence and of our goals, and express our hopes you will keep Fort Wool's national historic significance in mind in any further decisions you make with regard to it. Fort Wool was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1969 in recognition of its status as a companion fort to Fort Monroe, as a presidential retreat, a Civil War, World Wars I and II site, and as a place for contraband seeking sanctuary during the Civil War. Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Shepard Mallory, and Red Skelton were all there. We can find satisfactory place for migratory birds to nest while protecting our history and promoting tourism. We should do nothing less. Thank you very much. Questions?
No, thank you so much. Carol, I believe it's Mike Cobb. His public comments will be made part of our public record, correct?
Yes, they will.
Okay, thank you, sir, very much. Is there anybody else, Carol?
There is no one else signed up for public comment.
Okay, thank you. Okay, do I have a motion on the minutes?
Move.
So we accept the minutes.
Second. Any further discussion?
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor or opposition, Carol will call the roll.
Mr. Smoot,
Aye.
Mr. Dodson,
Yes.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Ms. Hines,
Aye.
Mr. Yates,
Aye.
Mr. Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Whitworth,
Aye.
Ms. DeTunk,
Aye.
Mr. Malbin,
Aye.
Mr. Kasprowitz,
Aye.
Mr. Brown, Mr. Stinson,
Aye.
Mr. Miller,
Aye.
Mr. Rucker.
Aye.
The roll's complete. The motion's passed.
Thank you, Carol. Lori Snyder.
Good afternoon, Madam Secretary and board members. I have one action item today for your consideration, and it is for a limited access control change, and it's actually comprised of two parts. This is along Route 1529. It's in Fauquier County in the Culpeper District, which is just south of Warrington. The first part is a request for a break in the limited access control, approximately 118 feet in length. It is for the development of a Royal Farms convenience store and gas station. There are multiple access points along this portion of Route 1529. The second part of this request is for an extension of the proposed limited access control along 1529 and along Route 687 Opal Road, which when extending this limited access control will actually eliminate 3 current entrances. So this request is to grant 1 entrance and in effect eliminate 3 that are existing today. We have also received a resolution of support from Fauquier County, and VDOT has reviewed this request and we recommend your approval.
Lori, thank you for that. Ms. DeTonk, is there anything you'd like to add?
Just that I'd like to make a motion for support of the motion as presented.
Second.
Any further discussion? Ms. Snyder, I just really want to thank you though for how you presented this, in that, you know, we're creating that 1 access point, but we're actually eliminating 3. So I really appreciated the clarification and the maps on that. So with that, all those in favor or opposition, Carol will call the roll.
Mr. Rucker,
Aye.
Mr. Miller,
Aye.
Mr. Stinson,
Aye.
Mr. Kasprowitz,
Aye.
Mr. Malbin,
Aye.
Ms. DeTunk,
Aye.
Mr. Whitworth,
Aye.
Mr. Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Yates,
Aye.
Ms. Hines,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Dodson,
Aye.
Mr. Smoot,
Aye.
Mr. Brown.
Aye.
The roll's complete. The resolution's passed.
Thank you. Susan Key.
Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon, Madam Secretary and members of the board. I have 2 action items for your consideration today. Both are project-related changes to limited access control. The first item for your consideration is the modification to the limited access needed to widen Route 286 or Fairfax County Parkway from 4 to 6 lanes. This project will widen the parkway from north of Route 29 Lee Highway to south of the interchange with Ox Road at 123. Additional project elements include intersection improvements at Burke Center Parkway and the construction of a new interchange at the existing at-grade intersection with Pope's Head Road. The interchange also provides for a future connection to the Shirley Gate extension. VDOT held a design public hearing on December 12, 2019 at the James Robinson Secondary School in Fairfax. Fairfax Department of Transportation supports this project in a letter of support dated April 17, 2020. Federal highway is not required for this, approval is not required for this change, and the total estimated cost is $290 million. Madam Secretary, would you like me to go ahead and go with the second also?
Sorry, Ms. Keen, yes.
Okay.
Please, we'll take them as a block.
Thank you. The second item is for limited access modifications needed at the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel project in the cities of Hampton and Norfolk in their Hampton Roads district. The project widens I-64 from west of Settlers Landing Road in Hampton to west of Tidewater Drive in Norfolk. Modifications include minor adjustments to the limited access near Mallory, Bayville, and Waco Streets, and also along Little Creek Road. In addition, the limited access control across Willoughby Bay will be eliminated since the bay is considered waters of the Commonwealth and is a navigable waterway. The Hampton Roads Connector Partners posted a willingness for public comment on May 28, 2020. The willingness expired on June 19th with no comments or other input. The directors of public works for both the cities of Norfolk and Hampton have submitted letters of support for this project dated June 4th and June 17th, respectively. Federal Highway approved the limited access modifications in a letter dated June 23rd, 2020, and I recommend both of these for approval by the CTV.
Thank you. Ms. Hines?
Madam Secretary, I'd like to move approval of these two items.
Second.
Oh, okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor or opposition, Carol will call the roll.
Mr. Smoot,
Aye.
Mr. Dodson,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Ms. Hines,
Aye.
Mr. Yates,
Aye.
Mr. Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Whitworth,
Aye.
Mr. Tunk. Aye. Mr. Malden,
Aye.
Mr. Kasprowitz,
Aye.
Mr. Brown, Mr. Stinson,
Aye.
Mr. Miller,
Aye.
Mr. Rucker.
Aye.
Roll's complete. The motion's passed.
Thank you, Ms. Mathis. Bronco.
Thank you.
Secretary Valentine, Commissioner and CTB board members, good afternoon. I have one decision briefing before you today. Decision briefing is from the Buchanan County Board of Supervisors, Bristol District. Approval of the Commonwealth Transportation Board is sought by the Buchanan County Board of Supervisors for the commemorative naming of Route 620 Deskins Road from the intersection of Route 83 Lovers Gap Road to the road name change to Indian Gap Road in Buchanan County as the Staff Sergeant Michael Allen Collins Memorial Highway. Buchanan County wishes to honor the life and sacrifice of Staff Sergeant Collins. Mr. Collins enlisted in the United States Army in 2003, served as a tank crewman and later as a tank commander during his 2 deployments to Iraq, obtained the rank of Staff Sergeant, and earned the Iraqi Freedom and the Iraqi Endurance Awards. Staff Sergeant Collins received many other awards and decorations during his 17-year career, including 2 Joint Services Commendation Medals, an Army Achievement Medal, 5 Good Conduct Medals, a National Defense Service Medal, and many others. Staff Sergeant Collins spent the last 8 years of his 17 years of service in the United States Army with the Defense Attaché System serving in Washington, D.C., Brussels, and Beijing, before passing away on January 6, 2020, after a courageous battle with cancer. VDOT supports this request.
Oh, Bronco, I can't tell you how moving it is to see Staff Sergeant Collins's photo here. Anyway, thank you for whoever was able to provide that. Mr. Stinson?
Madam Chair and members of the board, too often we get to memorialize someone. It's been many years after their service. In this case, we're getting this before us in a much quicker amount of time. I could not add anything to what Mr. Valek has already read about Staff Sergeant Collins' incredible career and the amount of sacrifice that he's made for our country. I would just say that I'm honored to bring forth the motion before this board to memorialize this hero in the naming of this segment.
Thank you, Mr. Stinson. I will take that as a motion. And do I have a second?
Second.
Ms. Mathis, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Johnson. Ms. Hines.
Aye.
Mr. Yates.
Aye.
Mr. Williams.
Aye.
Mr. Whitworth.
Aye.
Mr. Tunk.
Aye.
Mr. Malbin.
Aye.
Mr. Kasprowitz.
Aye.
Mr. Brown. Mr. Stinson.
Aye.
Mr. Miller.
Aye.
Mr. Rucker.
Aye.
Mr. Smoot.
Aye.
Mr. Dodson.
Aye.
The roll is complete. The motion's passed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Kim Pryor. And Kim, we'll go ahead and take your items as a block as well.
Okay. Good afternoon, Madam Secretary, members of the board. I have 2 items for your consideration today. The first is the addition of 13 projects to the 6-year improvement program. 6 of those are safety in nature, funded with high-risk rural funds. 2 of them are related to the Coastal Poplar Creek project, funded with about 58 bonds. 3 of the projects are supporting some advanced activities work related to the Hampton Roads Express lanes. There's also 1 project funded with ferry boat discretionary funds for the Jamestown Scotland Ferry and Hampton Roads. And finally, 1 MPO CMAQ funded project in Alexandria. The second item I have for you is my normal monthly transfers from May through June. And I recommend your approval of both items.
Do I have a motion?
So moved, Madam Secretary.
Second.
Any further discussion? Ms. Mathis, please call the roll for those who support or oppose.
Mr. Rucker.
Aye.
Mr. Miller.
Aye.
Mr. Stinson.
Aye.
Mr. Malbin.
Aye.
Mr. Tunk.
Aye.
Mr. Whitworth.
Aye.
Mr. Williams.
Aye.
Mr. Yates.
Aye.
Ms. Hines.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
Mr. Kasprowitz.
Aye.
Mr. Brown.
Aye.
Mr. Dodson.
Aye.
Mr. Smoot.
Aye.
The roll's complete. The resolutions have passed.
Thank you. Mr. Pittard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the board, I come to you today to request an allocation of funds for the Commonwealth's agreed upon annual allocation of funding for the track lease cost of Virginia Railway Express. For the past several years, VRE has been working under 1-year extension agreements with CSX and Amtrak for these costs, and multi-year allocations were not possible. VRE now has agreements in place for fiscal year 21. In consultation with the CFO of VRE, we originally estimated that existing grant funding would cover these costs through September, when we had anticipated adoption of a new 6-year improvement program. With the uncertainty around that original planned date, we have determined that we should make this allocation of funds now. DRPT has available carryover federal flexible STP funds from fiscal year 2020. So the source of funding for this proposed allocation of funds is not impacted by the economic impacts of the pandemic. Therefore, DRPT recommends that the CTB approve the addition of flexible STP funding in the total amount of $15,031,200 to the current 6-year improvement program for fiscal year 2021 track lease access payments of VRE to Amtrak, Norfolk Southern, and CSX. And with that, I'll gladly take any questions.
Do I have a motion?
Madam
So
Chair, I would
moved.
move approval. Second.
Any further discussion? C. Pittard. Okay, all those who support or oppose, Carol Mathis will call the roll.
Mr. Smoot,
Aye.
Mr. Dodson,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Ms. Hines,
Aye.
Mr. Yates,
Aye.
Mr. Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Whitworth,
Aye.
Mr. Tunk,
Aye.
Mr. Malbin,
Aye.
Mr. Kasprowitz,
Aye.
Mr. Brown,
Aye.
Mr. Stinson,
Aye.
Mr. Miller,
Aye.
Mr. Rucker.
Yay.
The roll's complete, the motion's passed.
Thank you very much.
I unmuted a little too soon, Mr. Rucker. Anyway, I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Pittard. Mr. Dudley, you're up.
Hey, good afternoon, Madam Secretary, members of the board. I have one item for your consideration today. This is a deallocation of economic development access funds originally provided to Appomattox County. The board originally provided the county $303,000 in economic access funds to assist the county develop an access road in the Appomattox Center for Business and Commerce for Express Natural Gas. Unfortunately, Express Natural Gas has decided not to locate in the business center. The county would like to cancel the project and return the allocation. A letter to that effect from the county is included in your decision packet. No expenditures or reimbursements have been incurred. We recommend approval of the deallocation of economic development, airports, and rail access funds in the amount of $303,000 so that the funds may be available for future allocations.
Thank you, Mr. Dudley. Mr. Dodson.
Yes, ma'am, Madam Secretary. This was requested by the Appomattox County Board, and obviously this decision was made before Dominion made a decision to discontinue the pipeline that was scheduled to hook up to this area. So I move the acceptance of the request.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor or opposition? Carol Mathis, please call the roll.
Mr. Rucker,
Aye.
Mr. Miller,
Aye.
Mr. Stinson,
Aye.
Mr. Brown, Kasprowitz,
Aye.
Mr. Malbin,
Aye.
Mr. Tunk,
Aye.
Mr. Whitworth,
Aye.
Mr. Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Yates,
Aye.
Ms. Hines,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Dodson,
Aye.
Mr. Smoot.
Aye.
The roll's complete, the motion's passed.
Thank you, Carol. Laura Farmer.
Good afternoon, Madam Secretary and members of the board. This afternoon, I bring before you a resolution that authorizes the issuance and sale of Commonwealth of Virginia Federal Transportation Grant Anticipation Revenue Notes, otherwise known as Garvey bonds, for a principal amount not to exceed $130 million. I workshopped this item last month for your consideration today. In your packet is the resolution that allows the department and staff to move forward to take this item to the Treasury Board and subsequent actions that are needed to issue the bonds currently planned for September of this year. In addition to the resolution, the 7th supplemental indenture is included, our preliminary official statement, the continuing disclosure agreement, as well as the notice of sale. Be happy to take any questions.
Motion.
So moved.
Second.
I think that was Ms. Hines, a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor or opposition? Ms. Mathis, please call the roll.
Mr. Dodson,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Ms. Hines. Aye. Mr. Yates,
Aye.
Mr. Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Whitworth,
Aye.
Mr. Tunk,
Aye.
Mr. Malbin,
Aye.
Mr. Kasperwitz,
Aye.
Mr. Brown,
Aye.
Mr. Stinson,
Aye.
Mr. Miller,
Aye.
Mr. Rucker,
Aye.
Mr. Smoot.
Aye.
The roll is complete. The motion's passed.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Farmer. Commissioner Brich.
Madam Secretary, members of the board, today I bring before you for your consideration the designation of the high occupancy toll lanes on I-64, extending the existing designations from I-664, 64 interchange in the city of Hampton to roughly the vicinity of the intersection of I-64 and Jefferson Avenue in Newport News. If you'll recall that over the last 18 months, VDOT has given a number of briefings both to the Commonwealth Transportation Board, the Roads Transportation Accountability Commission, as well as the Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization on the operational benefits of having a continuous and contiguous hot lane network between Jefferson Avenue in Newport News all the way to Bowers Hill in the city of Chesapeake. I should point out that this is just a continuation of what I briefed to the board last month on this designation. As I indicated at that point in time, the board has taken several actions in creating the Hampton Roads Express Lane network beginning in October of 2016 with the board's resolution converting the reversible segment to an existing hot lane now. The next section dealing with the Hampton Road or the high-rise bridge segment with the board taking action in September of 2017, and then with the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel project with the board's action in 2018. This remaining section is from, as I said, from 664 and 64's interchange in the city of Hampton to a point in the vicinity of the intersection of 64 and Jefferson Avenue in Newport News. It currently is an existing HOV facility that would be converted to a hot lane. It's important to note that the Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization has passed a resolution endorsing this section to become a hot facility, and it has been requested by HR TAC to fund the project. In fact, HR TAC took action to be able to fund this portion of the express lanes as well. So today we are recommending to the board to be able to designate this section of I-64 as a hot lane, designated as a minimum of an HO hot 2, and then provide for dynamic tolling of the facility. With that being said, I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
I'll make a
Madam-
motion we approve.
Thank you, Mr. Malvin.
Madam
Second.
Secretary?
Hold on, wait, do I have a second?
Second.
Yes, Ms. Hines.
Thanks. Just a really quick question, Commissioner. You said with a minimum of HOV2, does that decision have to come back to our board, or does it lie with someone else whether it goes up?
The Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization has requested that it be a Hot 2 designation as well. I will note that the initial tolling policies ultimately will be set by HR TAC, and that's a part of the master tolling agreement that will give you additional opportunities to be able to review this week. But it would be just the Hot 2 designation in agreement with what the Hampton Roads region is already requesting.
Okay, so the actual governing of whether that would ever change will rely in the master tolling agreement that we're going to take up later. Is that correct? The process by which it would change if it were to change?
If it were to change, those policies would be responsible up underneath the future master tolling agreement, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? All those in favor or opposition, Ms. Mathis, please call the roll.
Mr. Rucker,
Aye.
Mr. Miller,
Aye.
Mr. Stinson,
Aye.
Mr. Brown, Mr. Kasperwitz,
Aye.
Mr. Malbin,
Aye.
Mr. Tunk,
Aye.
Whitworth,
Aye.
Mr. Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Yates,
Aye.
Ms. Hines,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Dodson,
Aye.
Mr. Smoot,
Aye.
the roll's complete, the motion's passed.
Thank you. Mr. Caples.
Madam Secretary, members of the board, I hope everyone's doing well. I have one project for your action or consideration and ultimate action for today's meeting. That is order number C10. That is a Bristol District project on I-77 in Wythe County. It's for the bridge replacement over Cove Creek. We had 7 bidders on this project. As you can see in the presentation here, the bid did exceed the design estimate, but was within the range of the evaluative estimate. And I will bring this to your attention. 3 of the 7 bidders were within 1.5% of one another. So it was very tight bidding. After conducting our bid analysis, we feel that the bid represents both market value and a good value for the Commonwealth, and we are recommending for your award.
Mr. Stinson. Stinson? Okay, do I have a motion from the board?
So moved.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor or opposition? Ms. Mathis, please call the roll.
Mr. Smoot,
Aye.
Mr. Dodson,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Ms. Hines,
Aye.
Mr. Yates,
Aye.
Mr. Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Whitworth,
Aye.
Mr. Tunk, Mr. Malbin,
Aye.
Mr. Kasperwitz,
Aye.
Mr. Brown,
Aye.
Mr. Stinson,
Aye.
Mr. Miller,
Aye.
Mr. Rucker.
Aye.
The roll is complete. The motion's passed.
Thank you. Is there any new business from the board? Yes,
Secretary, Mr. Dotson. I was going to ask you, with the controversies going on in the state of Virginia about naming, what is the status of the, I think it was a committee or subcommittee in relation to naming of roads, if they come up for discussions in the future as far as change?
Yes, well, we have a policy. I mean, we have policies in place. Is Joanne Maxwell on the call?
Yes, Madam Chair, I'm here.
Yes. Would you mind just kind of giving a brief overview on where we see the task force and where we hope the task force goes?
Absolutely.
Oh, you know what? Very hard to hear you.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yes.
At this point, we have, I think the task force is close to finishing its business. We have a draft set of guidelines that we're required by law to basically enact. And I think the plan at this point is to go ahead and put those items in front of the CTB, meet perhaps one more time with the task force, and put the guidelines in front of the CTB for action, approval and action in the fall months, in the upcoming fall months. And so at that point in time, we will be prepared. But at this point, there's no reason that the CTB cannot continue to address or to entertain actions or requests for namings at this point. These guidelines, I think, just clarify the roles of the CTB versus the General Assembly, et cetera.
I think this is part of what we have learned in this is that, you know, it is the way in which roads are arranged in Virginia is fairly complex because we have the CTB guidelines, we have the General Assembly. Cities are governed differently than counties. The CTB can do, you know, individual jurisdictions with a resolution. The General Assembly could do the road without individual resolutions. And so I, in meeting with Joanne Maxwell and Amy White recently, Mr. Dodson, I really asked, besides just the guidelines they bring to us, I think it would be really helpful for all of us to understand better the different roles that are at play, who is responsible for what, and, you know, are there ways that we can coordinate better? So it's, as we are explaining this to constituents and media, and, you know, you just realize that it does get somewhat complicated at times. And so I'm really going to ask the task force if they will consider clarifying those roles and responsibilities when they bring the guidelines back to the CTB.
Right. Madam Chair. Madam Secretary, thank you for asking that question. One other question I had, are there 2 Lee highways in the state? We've been getting emails from different people, and I thought Lee Highway was Route 11, but it's another Route 2 on 29. Are there 2 Lee highways or only 1 Lee highway supposedly in the state?
Ms. Maxwell, do you know? We were, there's a huge list. Do you know the answer to that question?
Madam Chair, I believe that is the case. There is more than one.
You know what? We can't hear you.
There is a Lee Memorial Highway, I believe, a Lee Highway. There may even be a third, but we can find that out. We have put together a list of highways. The VDOT has a list of highways that have been named by either the Commonwealth Transportation Board or the General Assembly, commemorating or, you know, naming the various roads and bridges, transportation facilities after individuals. We have that list available, or having such a list, and we can certainly make that available to members if they're interested in seeing that.
I think for those of you who weren't able to hear Ms. Maxwell at that time, but I think, Joanne, you were saying that you could make that list available.
That is correct.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Was there someone else who wished to speak?
Yes, Madam Secretary, this is Cedric. This is an issue that is significantly important across the cross section of our communities. And I am getting bombarded with emails and phone calls about Jeff Davis Highway that runs through this district. I think for the public, it would be great to have that framing of the various processes that are available for this change. And you said that this is going to be available later this fall to the TCB. I don't think we can wait until late in the fall or mid-fall. The sooner we can get this information, I think the better we are in terms of serving the interest of the citizens of this Commonwealth.
So, Ms. Maxwell, would you just go through the policy that we have? Because this has been existing. It turned out that last March, the Attorney General's office issued an opinion based on a legislative request that actually opened the door for the CTB to be able to rename roads and highways that the General Assembly had named. And prior to that opinion, it was believed that that was not possible.
Right.
Which is very specific to Jefferson Davis. So, Joanne Maxwell, are you there just to kind of go?
Madam Chairwoman, this is Carlos Brown. Can I just chime in real quick? And I think Mr. Yates is on the call. I just want to kind of give an overview because we worked on this with Joanne and staff. And I think the bottom line of the question, Cedric, I'm sorry, I'm causing feedback, is that if the localities have, to the Secretary's point, it was believed that the CTB could not change names that the General Assembly had named. The clarification that came out of that opinion and our understanding of the laws of the Commonwealth is that the CTB can make those name changes, but they have to be initiated by the locality. So essentially, if there is a road in question, Jeff Davis, Lee, whatever it may be, for that portion of the road that's in the jurisdiction, that jurisdiction would have to make that request, and then the CTB could act. No, Ms. Maxwell, please correct me if I said anything incorrect.
No, that is correct. We just need a resolution from the jurisdiction that is presented to either the CTB or VDOT, and there's a willingness to pay for the change, which I don't think we've encountered a lot of issues regarding that. But it's a request from the jurisdiction with a resolution. So we are able to do that today, Mr. Rucker. But there have been, questions about what if it extends beyond your jurisdiction, and just many different questions that we receive, and how we manage that can actually be done within the CTB. It can be done in the General Assembly. Cities actually have a different, do not have those same regulations. So in any case, it's just clarifying all this, but we can today receive a resolution from a jurisdiction to be brought before the board to change the name.
And Madam Chair, I would interject too, and Mr. Rucker may have made reference to this, that there are situations, and I think you mentioned, when a particular such a road runs through a city, if that road happens to be a part of the urban system, then it is the city, it's within the city's authority to rename that portion of the road. So there are a multitude of, or a variety of ways in which a road could arguably be renamed, whether in portions or in total.
And so to the point that I just think it would be interesting for the board to see the roles and responsibilities of all the possible naming entities, so that we at least, have some understanding about how this is done or could be done. So, Mr. Rucker, if there's something immediate, I just invite you to touch base with Joanne Maxwell, and we can take care of that.
Yep, Madam Secretary, this is Brich Stotts again. Most of us on the board obviously went through the process of Arlington, I believe. And it was a good process. It was very intense and well done. I strongly suggest the board take the same approach. There's a lot of quick decision making going through the Commonwealth now about different localities, and something being in violation of state General Assembly legislation that was passed. But I think we should just work through the process and, work like we did before, which it came out to the ultimate desire of the locality.
Yes, Mr. Dodson, I think that's why I asked specifically the clarification. I think members of cities and not, I mean, just local citizens just really want explicitly to understand what the process is. It has been very confusing to a number of groups.
Yeah, and again, just to echo, I think it has been unnecessarily confusing because really it starts with the jurisdiction, city or county, passing a resolution and addressing that to the CTB or VDOT. That's where it all has to start. And then the CTB can take action from there. Nothing, as current law would have it, can happen absent that locality taking the first step. So I think the response, and I've had some queries, is if that's your concern, then your local city council or board of supervisors would need to take the issue up, and then we can respond and react accordingly. But I really think it's actually that simple. And we need to point folks to their local governing bodies.
Ms. Maxwell, and I appreciate that, Mr. Brown. There is a difference with cities. And so we actually have, if Amy White is on the call, Amy White and Joanne did kind of summarize some of this for people so that they could have some clarity on it. So these are some of the issues that I really asked to be clarified for everyone, because there are distinctions, but we're really focused on the roads that we are able to name. But I agree with you, and Mr. Dodson, I appreciate what you said about the process. The process is the same for us right now. We haven't made changes to it, but I do believe that there is some confusion about how it's done. So is Amy White on the call?
Yes, Secretary, I am here. And if it would be helpful, Joanne and I could provide a basic summary to the board that outlines the responses we've given to citizens in the media. And I know Mr. Rucker was involved with one of them, and we certainly appreciate your forwarding that to us so that we can respond consistently to everyone with the same information. So we're happy to share that with the board following today's meeting.
Thank you.
Madam Secretary, this is Mary. I would really appreciate having that language, whatever it is we're using for citizens.
Mm-hmm.
I am getting, one every couple of days, and I've basically been pointing people back to their governing board. Because even if it's within the city's power to do it, they still have to go to the governing board. But I do think it would be useful to have some standard language we could all just use.
Madam Secretary,
thank you.
This is Greg. I would suggest as a committee member with Mr. Brown that maybe that draft could go to the two committee members really quickly, and then we could look at it and then shoot it out to the whole board if that would work. Since we
that'd be great.
Committee.
That would be great.
If that's okay with Mr. Brown.
Mr. Brown, are you muted?
No, I think I just have a sound delay or something. No, that's fine. I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, we'll be glad to do it.
Okay. Excellent. Excellent. So thank you all. Anything else?
Okay. I wondered with regard to two items that have been delayed, and I assume because of budget issues and determination, that being the transportation alternative list and the revenue sharing list. Would it be possible to at least share with our constituents the list, even though the list has not been voted upon, wondering whether or not any or all of any projects on that list may affect a governing entity's decisioning on smart scale that is going to be coming to a close, I believe, fairly soon. And I'm not sure when we're going to be voting on approving of the TA or the revenue sharing, but would it be inappropriate to at least share what the list is that's going to be approved?
You know what, Mr. Whitworth, that question has not come up because we are still working through all the budget items. I will look into that. I know that as we are preparing for the upcoming session, that's where the focus has been, but I will check on where that process is.
Okay.
Thank you. Anything else? Okay. You know, as I mentioned earlier, we are going to be taking up the master tolling agreement in the coming days, whenever we can set a time so that everyone has a time to review it. And so we will be getting back to you as soon as possible on that. And if there's nothing else for today, I will get back to Mr. Whitworth on the revenue sharing and transportation alternatives. Mr. Yates and Mr. Brown are going to work with Joanne Maxwell and Amy regarding the guidelines we have in place now for naming of highways and roads. With those two assignments, or actually three, we will adjourn today's meeting.
Madam Secretary, I have one quick question, if I may, regarding the master tolling discussion. Can I assume that we're going to be working off the draft that we currently have, or will we be receiving an updated draft?
For now, I recommend that everybody review what's there, but when we set the time and date of the meeting, we will make sure you have the final then.
Thank you.
Secretary, would it be helpful for us to send any questions we have in?
Yes, that would be really great.
Okay.
Yes, I've heard from some, and so I'm certainly keeping those, but yes, it would just be far more efficient if you would send those in. Okay, with that, I'm really adjourning this time. Thank you all.
Hope to see everybody in a month, maybe.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.